A homeless man lived quietly beneath the cold underbelly of an old, forgotten parking garage. One rainy night, he came across a German shepherd, shivering, soaked to the bone, yet its eyes still gleamed with an inexplicable light in the dark. No one would have imagined that half a sandwich shared in silence that night would begin a journey of revival for them both. What made the dog stay? And what followed that first look, when two lives crossed paths under leaking concrete? Basement number 12 was tucked away at the end of a narrow concrete slope behind a parking lot that had been shut down for years. The faded yellow word "exit" had peeled almost completely off the wall, now no more than a dull, smudged patch swallowed by green moss and dry dust. Beneath the bones of Coldmere City, where rusted pipes groaned with the stress of shifting temperatures, and the streetlights barely reached a few feet before being swallowed whole by damp air and the stained stench of corroded iron. Travis Dorn had patched together a life as fragile and temporary as a single stitch holding the edge of a threadbare cloth. He had chosen a spot right up against the far wall, in a corner pressed tight between two crumbling concrete columns, where the space pinched just enough to form a shallow alcove, dry compared to the rest of the basement, and barely big enough to lay down a flattened piece of old cardboard, prop up a sagging backpack, and sleep with his back to the wall without wind cutting into his neck like a blade. He still wore the same battered boots from the previous winter, not out of habit, but because once they were off, the cold would crawl into his bones faster than dreams could form. He slept curled like a wire bent too long. Not from tension, but because his body had grown used to narrow spaces, where one didn't need to stretch to survive, only to breathe evenly and stay still. Once, Travis had owned a small wood shop on the south side of the city, where morning sunlight poured through the skylight and onto a camphor wood bench, the whole place infused with the soft scent of polish. He had built a wooden clock, setting the hands himself with such precision that nearby families used it to time school drop-offs. His name had once been written by hand in Christmas cards, called upon with trust whenever someone needed a jammed drawer fixed or a crooked cabinet door realigned. But those days, like the silver in his temples, belonged to a past not exactly far, but distant enough to be covered in a fine layer of dust, like a window streaked with rainwater no one bothered to wipe. Since the day a faulty saw sent sparks that burned his workshop to the ground, Travis no longer looked at wood as material. He saw it the way one looks at an old photograph, familiar enough that each glance stirred a quiet heaviness in his chest. His wife had died 6 months before that night. When the fire rose, the building lit up in the dark like a candle hastily lit at a memorial no one witnessed. Travis sat on the curb, fingers clutching the edge of a fire truck, not crying, not speaking, just bowing his head into his folded arms until the smoke cleared. The firefighters asked no questions. No one from his past came looking. He hadn't left the city. He had simply shrunk into an unnamed corner, like someone folded him up and left him behind a forgotten wall. Every day in Travis's world was measured by the wheezing pull of the old elevator cable across the lot, by the tilt of light slipping through the cracks in corrugated tin, by the sound of footsteps mixed with the clatter of a plastic bottle cap dropped by someone passing overhead. His food came from a northern charity kiosk, a place that served thin soup on Mondays and dry sandwiches on Wednesdays. Occasionally, he received a bottle of water or a sweater someone forgot on a park bench and never came back for. Travis didn't speak to anyone. But he often whispered to the things inside his bag, to a broken tape measure, to a nearly empty bottle of wood glue, to a leather notebook he had never written in, as though preserving his voice was the only way to stop it from disappearing altogether. He didn't sing, didn't count days, didn't write anything down. But he always knew when Monday began. That was Sandwich Day, and he always saved it until nightfall, when the streets had quieted and the cold had settled back in, so he could chew slowly in the dark. Not because he was stingy, but because he didn't want anything to vanish too quickly. That night, the wind had begun to pick up around 9. In Coldmere, wind always arrived with the chill of iron and the creak of tree branches from some unnamed distance. The makeshift tin sheets at the garage entrance clanged together like scissor blades dragged across metal. Travis pulled his coat collar high, pressing his back against the wall, his hand resting on a worn paper bag softened by moisture. Inside, wrapped in thin plastic, was his sandwich: 2 slices of white bread, a piece of cold ham, and a line of mustard, yellow like the last sunlight of autumn caught between seasons. He planned to eat half and curl up early. The night felt like it would stretch long, and the wind was creeping deeper into the basement than usual. But just as he lifted his head, a subtle shift along the opposite wall made him freeze. It wasn't the sound of shoes on stairs, nor rats darting through the dark. This movement had the rhythm of breath, a weight heavier than rodents or wind-churned dust. Travis tilted his head, slowly lifting his chin to let his eyes catch the flicker of something beneath the faint tremble of a flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. At the edge of the cement floor, where rainwater had pooled into a shallow reflection, a fur-covered shape lay curled in a tight arc, head tilted slightly, one ear twitching at the sound of metal striking the rooftop, then folding again. Under the blinking light, bones showed faintly beneath slick fur, and its chest rose and fell in soft pulses, like a coal still glowing under rain. Travis didn't move. His lips pressed together, his gaze drawn toward the creature by something invisible. Not fear, not curiosity, but a quiet stirring in his chest when one realizes they are not the only one enduring this storm. His eyes dropped to the old paper bag. Slowly he opened it and split the sandwich into 2 even halves. One piece stayed in his hand. The other, carefully wrapped in a tissue, he pushed gently toward the shadows, toward those eyes that hadn't once looked away. Silence fell, pierced only by the tap of rain on the roof and the whistle of wind through steel beams. The creature didn't react immediately, nor did it retreat. Amber eyes remained bright under the dim light, polished by a fatigue that had no name. And then slowly, the dog moved. Not with haste, not with stealth. Its first steps made barely a sound, soft as wet cloth against stone. It stepped toward the bread, sniffed it, and ate it in 2 clean bites. Then it didn't leave, and it didn't come closer. It sat where it was, raised its head, and looked at Travis, as if waiting for a cue in a language neither had ever spoken, but both somehow understood. Travis looked at the dog for a long while, gradually recognizing that there was none of the guardedness, none of the flinching wariness that animals usually carry when they've known the cruelty of being chased away or left behind. Instead, in those eyes, there was only weariness, the kind that speaks of long roads, of cold, of hunger, of solitude. And yet, flickering within that tired gaze, something still glowed faintly, a shred of awareness, a threadbare hope that, strangely enough, had managed to cling to a vestige of pride. He shifted his body toward the coat draped loosely over his shoulders and, with one swift motion, shrugged it off. The fabric, heavy and damp, sent a brief chill across his back, but it also carried the last trace of warmth as Travis folded it carefully and began to crawl, slowly and deliberately, toward the dog. Every movement calculated, every gesture mindful not to make a sound too loud, too sudden. He said nothing, only held the coat out in front of him with both hands spread wide, as if inviting someone to take shelter under the eaves during a sudden downpour. The dog did not retreat, nor did it bark. It remained there, unmoving, watching as Travis gently draped the coat over its back, pulling it down and around its belly like a small blanket wrapped around a sleeping life tucked away in the faded corners of the city. Travis eased himself back to his spot, folding his knees to his chest. Water dripped from a few spots in the cracked ceiling, each drop landing into an old puddle with the same repetitive rhythm. A quiet, familiar ticking of time in a place that had long since stopped keeping track of it. After a while, the dog lay down, resting its head on its front paws, its eyes half open but unfocused, as though, for the first time in a long while, it had decided to allow itself to rest. Travis didn't sleep. He leaned against the cold concrete pillar, turning his face toward the animal curled up by the opposite wall. And every time the wind howled through the gaps above, he felt, faint but real, a sense of warmth return from where the dog lay. Not heat exactly, but the presence of something else, something other than himself. He parted his lips, his voice a whisper, more a test than a question, as if trying to remember what it felt like to speak after so long. "Where did you come from?" The question slipped from his mouth and vanished into the air, leaving no echo. But on the far side, the tail stirred gently, then tapped once against the ground, a single deliberate beat, like a knock on a quiet door. Travis chuckled, a hoarse, dry sound, brief and hollow but not bitter. He glanced at the half sandwich still in his hand, then out through the bunker's entrance, where the rain had begun to fall in thicker, steadier waves. The dim light from the street beyond filtered down through the half-fogged pane above, casting a soft glow right where the dog was lying, as if the night had saved its gentlest corner for that exact place. He didn't know if the animal would still be there in the morning, nor whether it would choose to stay or move on. But in that moment, amid the dampness of the basement, the even murmur of rain, and the lingering scent of bread in his palm, Travis made no move to change anything. He turned, leaning his back lightly against the pillar behind him, the sandwich still resting in his hand, its plastic wrapping slowly warming against his skin. His fingers, thin, calloused, but still bearing a trace of the sensitivity once required to choose the right wood grain in the right light, tilted the sandwich slightly to the left, then the right, as though weighing something that had nothing to do with taste. The German shepherd, still curled beneath Travis's old coat, didn't look up directly, but one ear twitched, the subtle movement betraying that it had sensed the smallest change in the air between them. Travis inhaled deeply, the smell of bread mingling with the old rain and the lingering trace of machine oil from the days when vehicles still rumbled through this space. A moment later, he tore the sandwich in two along its length, not with a single impatient snap, but the way he used to split wood with a fine saw, slowly, evenly, ensuring no piece would break or splinter. A thin layer of mustard oozed out along the edge, golden and soft like the last light of day caught on an unfinished window frame. He kept one half in his left hand. The other he wrapped in a napkin, then slowly lowered himself to the ground and began to crawl again, carefully, toward the silent creature lying beyond the shadowed divide. The space between them stretched like a quiet bridge, one built not of words, not of signals, but of breath alone. Travis placed the sandwich just an arm's length away from the dog, then retreated, every motion smooth, contained, as though afraid he might break something newly formed and still too fragile to name. He returned to his corner, sat down, hands resting lightly on his knees, eyes turned toward the dog, not pressing, not expectant. In his mind, there was no thought of what it might do, only the presence of what is, like setting a lamp on a doorstep and letting the wind decide whether it should flicker or keep burning a little longer. After some time, the dog stirred. Its back arched slightly as it rose, head lifting, nose hovering just above the floor, testing the air like it was remembering how to trust it. One step, then another, not hesitant but not confident either. Simply a quiet moving forward, as if closing the distance between two lives that had, until now, remained estranged from everything else in the world. It lowered its head, sniffed the napkin for a long while before finally taking the sandwich in its jaws. 2 chews, then 3, and it was gone. It didn't retreat. It didn't come closer. It simply sat back down, licked its lips, and looked at Travis, not with gratitude, not with suspicion, but with a gaze that seemed to say, "I have received, and I understand." The wind outside had softened. The rain still fell, but gentler now. A faint current of warmth crept in through the corrugated gaps, carrying the scent of damp soil and distant trees from the nearby park. Travis opened his left hand, brought the remaining sandwich to his mouth, and took a small bite. The bread was soft, slightly salty, and warmer than expected. He chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving the quiet figure across the dim room. And in that moment, he realized he was not eating to survive, but to share. Something had shifted between them. Not quite familiarity, but no longer tension. Between a man who hadn't spoken a name in months and a dog who had forgotten how long it had been since it last belonged. A rhythm of breath had begun to form, unhurried, undefined, but enough to let them both be still, together, in the same fragment of night. The dog exhaled a slow, drawn-out breath, its ears drooping as its chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, like the sound of a heartbeat echoing in an empty room long since abandoned by voices. Above, the flickering fluorescent light overhead cut out in a sudden blink of darkness, only to sputter back on again. And in that stark, momentary burst of brightness, Travis caught sight of something beneath the damp fur at the animal's neck. A thin leather strap, frayed at the edges, snapped clean on one end, but still holding a small, round piece of metal that glinted faintly against the shadows. He leaned forward, carefully, his hand brushing against the edge of the coat draped over the dog's body, and reached with the quiet precision of someone who had once built his life around the smallest of details. Someone who knew, by instinct and experience, that everything fragile deserved to be approached not with hesitation, but with respect. His fingers slipped gently through the thick fur, brushing against the cold skin beneath, feeling the muscles that had begun to soften under his touch, until at last he managed to lift the tag up to eye level. It was no bigger than a coin, dulled along the rim with a few small dents marring its surface. The flickering ceiling light caught the etched letters just right, and a single word rose into view. Uneven, worn, but unmistakable. Warden. Nothing else, no phone number, no name, just that one word, like a whisper left behind in the dust, a call lost in time. Travis froze, staring at it for a long while, as though trying to decipher something that didn't exist in the lettering itself, but in the feeling the word stirred. A word that sounded like bootsteps on concrete, like the name you'd give to someone who had once stood guard over something important, something now forgotten. Not the kind of name one forgets easily. He let the tag fall back into place, gently smoothing the fur over it again, then withdrew his hand, eyes still resting on the sleeping face beside him. Outside, dawn was beginning to push against the edges of the night. The first light of morning slipped through the small, dust-caked window near the top of the slope, a blade of silver white cutting across the basement floor, like a fine line dividing darkness and day. Travis rose, unfolding his legs with a wince as blood returned to joints stiff from too many hours curled tight against the cold. His knee cracked softly, but he didn't pause. He gathered the wool scarf, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his backpack. Then he leaned forward, placed a hand lightly on the dog's back, and spoke, not loudly, not softly, but with a tone that felt right. "Hey, Warden." The name passed from his mouth with a strange resonance. Not quite intimate, not at all distant, but simply true, as though it had belonged there all along. The dog opened its eyes. It didn't jerk or flinch, just opened them slowly, lifted its head, and looked at Travis. Not with the hollow gaze of the night before, but with a faint warmth spreading like early sunlight across the surface of water after the season's first rain. Travis tapped his shoulder gently. "Come on, let's go outside for a bit." Warden stood, shook the coat from his back in one fluid motion, then padded toward Travis. Not in haste, but with no hesitation either. Travis slung the backpack over one shoulder, picked up his coat, gave it a shake to dislodge the dust and damp, then threw it over his shoulders, pulled the hood up, and began to walk toward the ramp that led to the street, where the light of morning now stretched itself over the cracks in the concrete, like a promise barely spoken. They did not look back as they left the basement. Behind them, the fluorescent light flickered one last time, and then went dark for good. The early morning on Coldmere Street was still slick with rain. The paving stones glistened under the pale light, like mirrors fogged by breath. Travis kept his hands in the pockets of his coat, walking along a narrow alley that cut across the back of an old residential block where shuttered wooden windows were nailed shut with rusted spikes, and moss had claimed the steps as its own. Warden moved beside him, step for step, pausing now and then to glance at the delivery carts being pushed out from the eastern market toward the wider roads. They said nothing. The sound of Travis's footsteps mingled with the tap of Warden's claws on the wet stone, creating a rhythm, a soft, steady cadence, like a clock ticking inside his old workshop. Simple, unhurried, and just enough to remind them both that time was still passing. They passed a newsstand just opening for the day, where an elderly man was lifting the first rolls of magazines onto the wooden rack. The old man looked at Travis and nodded, not smiling, but not turning away either, his eyes fixed on Warden. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he pulled a piece of biscuit from his pocket and held it out. Warden didn't lunge. He paused, turned to Travis for a brief glance, as if asking, and then stepped forward calmly to take it from the man's hand. No bark, no sound. The old man nodded once more, then turned away and resumed stacking the papers. Travis stood for a breath, his eyes lifting to the sky, where the early sun was beginning to push the gray clouds aside, carving a soft streak of amber between the thinning branches above the small square just ahead. He didn't know where he was going. He wasn't trying to figure it out. He only knew that for the first time in a very long while, he was walking away from shelter without the weight of leaving something behind. And at the small intersection that opened onto the market grounds, where the scent of fresh bread mixed with the dampness of rain-soaked soil, Travis came to a stop, his gaze drifting to a child standing beside a lottery box at the mouth of the alley, red hood drooping over her shoulders, arms wrapped around a cardboard tray of colorful scratch tickets. Warden stopped beside him, his eyes fixed in the same direction. Travis furrowed his brow. The first breeze of the morning swept through the street, carrying with it the papery rip of a winning lottery ticket someone had tossed carelessly into the gutter, now torn by water and wind. No one spoke. The child quietly fanned out the remaining tickets between small fingers like unfolding a paper fan, each corner already damp from the lingering night dew. The words, lucky, gold, spin, shimmered faintly under the soft sunlight of dawn. Travis was about to walk past, giving no thought to the smudge of red seeping along the edge of a cardboard box. But just as he turned, Warden jerked forward with sudden force. The leash tied around his waist snapped taut, pulling his hip sharply toward the lottery stand. "What is it?" Travis stopped mid-step, turning to look, but Warden didn't acknowledge the question. The German shepherd stood braced, muscles coiled, eyes locked on the box of tickets, and then, without warning, barked. A single bark, full, firm, unmistakably clear. The child jumped, nearly dropping the carton. Travis froze where he stood. That bark wasn't panic. It wasn't alarm. It was more like a knock on some unseen door, an instinctive signal that even Warden himself may not have consciously meant to send, but which rose from somewhere deeper, older than logic. "I just said it last night," Travis murmured, half to himself, half to the memory of words whispered in the basement when two bodies lay close for warmth. "If we win the lottery, you and I get steak. Real plates. The good kind." Behind him, the sounds of people buying breakfast and the steady drip of rainwater from a cracked gutter painted an ordinary morning. Nothing unusual about the street or the time. But Warden's unwavering gaze, that singular anchored look, made Travis hesitate. He stepped closer. "One ticket. Whichever one feels lucky to you, kid." The child glanced up, eyes flitting between the stack, then quietly pulled out a pale teal ticket, its silver edges glinting. Holding it with 2 fingers, the child passed it over. Travis reached into his pocket, pulled out 2 wrinkled dollar bills, handed them over, and took the ticket, stepping back beneath the awning of the nearby convenience store. Warden sat at his feet, motionless. Travis fished an old silver coin from the side pocket of his jeans, the same coin he'd kept since the day his wallet's zipper broke. Its worn face caught a sliver of sunlight breaking across the sidewalk. He sat down, leaned his back against the wall, and laid the ticket across his knee. The first scratch, thin silver film flaked away, revealing a bell icon. He scratched again. Another bell. The coin moved with surprising grace, slicing through the surface like a miniature blade. A third scratch. Another bell. He paused, looking at Warden. Warden remained still, one ear perked just slightly, as if awaiting a second wind from someplace unknown. Travis scratched the third box. 3 bells. His heartbeat slowed. He flipped the ticket over, brought it close to his eyes. Small print at the bottom confirmed it clearly. 3 bell symbols equals $300,000. His fingers went slack, and the coin slipped from his hand, rolling across the sidewalk and coming to rest beside a loose tile. He stared at the ticket as though it were playing a trick on his eyes, as though the whole moment were nothing more than a trick of light caught between sleep and waking. But the back of the ticket remained clear, the number unchanged, the official seal printed plainly in the corner, untouched by moisture. Warden wagged his tail. Not wildly, not excitedly, just once, slow and sure, as if the dog, too, had sensed something was shifting. Not the fortune, not the dollar amount, but the color of light that had just quietly changed on Travis's face. Travis sat still for a few more breaths. No smile, no shout. Just drew the ticket close to his chest and closed his eyes for a moment. The wind passed again, carrying the sound of early joggers' footsteps and the metallic clatter of soda cans tipping in a pushcart further down the street. Travis remained seated, one hand now resting gently on Warden's head. "You just changed my whole damn life plan, you know that?" Warden leaned forward, brushed his nose against Travis's knee. A little while later, Travis stood up, dusted off his pants, picked up the silver coin, tucked the ticket into the inner pocket of his coat, and turned to look at Warden, this time with a longer gaze, one that held a warmth suggesting he was already redrawing the map of the city in his mind, searching for a place worthy of taking this creature to. He walked slowly toward the intersection, where the old street sign pointed toward downtown Coldmere. Warden didn't hesitate. The German Shepherd walked beside him in perfect rhythm, each step steady, each tap of paw against pavement echoing like the quiet opening beats of a chapter that had just begun. Up ahead, the sun had climbed above the roof of the old bank, casting a deep, golden beam directly across the patch of sidewalk they were approaching. A beam bright enough to reveal the dusty sign above the door. Beneath the aged, streaked glass, the hand-painted lettering had chipped and faded. The Riverside Flame, Steakhouse and Diner. Inside, the lighting glowed a gentle amber. The place wasn't crowded. A waitress was straightening the table linens. The scent of cracked pepper drifted out through the slightly ajar door, mingling with the warmth of grilled fat and toasted bread, winding its way into the mind like a memory from another life, where meals came on time, chairs were pulled out for sitting, and the first course was always the most comforting thing you'd taste all day. Travis stopped at the doorstep. He pulled the glass door gently. A tiny bell chimed. The waitress looked up. A woman in her 30s, hair tied low, a white apron with navy stripes around her waist. She stepped out, looked Travis up and down, then looked at the dog beside him. No frown, no questions, just a nod, subtle, accepting. "Window seat okay?" Travis smiled faintly. "If it's all right, 2 steaks, 1 without sauce, chopped small, and just water. For both." She noted it silently and walked away. They sat down. The table near the window overlooked the river. The water flowed slowly, reflecting a sky already high with clouds stretched thin like feathers. On the table's surface, the late morning light fell sideways, catching the old varnish's scratches like faint scars in a story told without words. Murphy placed his chin on Travis's knee. Travis looked down. "Mind if I call you Murphy?" The dog didn't respond, save for a quiet lick of the lips and a long, steady breath. But the eyes remained fixed on him, a gaze that needed no confirmation at all. They didn't say a word, but as they turned the corner leading down the small slope at the end of the street, Travis suddenly stopped. He had spotted a makeshift wooden sign nailed across the doorway of an abandoned house, the lettering hastily painted in uneven white strokes. "Need help? Come tomorrow. 9 a.m. back alley." Below it fluttered a small red scrap of paper, tugged gently by the breeze. Just an old calendar page, torn from a notebook, with a handwritten line in blue ink. "Bring nothing but time." Travis read it in silence, standing still for a long moment. Murphy didn't tug the leash. The dog simply sat by his leg, looking up, ears tilted slightly backward, waiting for a signal that would never be spoken aloud. Travis didn't take down the note. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out his worn phone, and took a photo with the scratched camera lens, then turned away, without a word. By the time they crested the slope, they had reached a street corner with an arched awning and a faded wooden sign in dark chestnut brown. Maisie's Oven, since 1962. A small bakery nestled quietly between a tailor's shop and a second-hand bookstore. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with melting butter drifted through the cracked door, slowing the air around them as if the world had just taken a breath. There was no bell when the door opened, just the soft creak of old wood and the faint ticking from the electric oven within. A woman in her 60s, her silver hair pinned up in a bun, wearing an apron embroidered with tiny flowers, looked up as Travis pushed open the door. "What can I get you this morning, friend?" "I'm looking for a room to rent, if you know anyone nearby." "The second floor here still has one. Small but clean. Got a window, private toilet, and the outlets still work. If you don't mind the sound of bread rising, you can go take a look." Travis glanced up at the wooden staircase behind the counter. Murphy followed his gaze. "How much a month?" "$70. Doesn't include bread. But I usually have scraps left in the morning and some weak coffee." He nodded. 10 minutes later, they stepped into the upstairs room. A narrow space with low ceilings, painted in a faded gray, the wooden floorboards worn smooth in the center. A sliding window overlooked the back of the bakery, where tangled purple vines stretched through a rusted iron frame. The single bed sat against the wall, draped in blue and white striped sheets. Beneath it lay a thin rug printed with an old map of the world, still creased from being folded too long. Travis dropped his backpack in the corner. Murphy stepped forward slowly, sniffed a full circle around the room, then curled up at the foot of the bed, right where the morning light had crept in and touched the edge of his paw. Their first morning in the room passed without a word. Travis sat on the edge of the bed, holding a dense slice of bread, spreading peanut butter over it with the back of a plastic knife. The bread had been brought up by the bakery owner, along with a cup of weak coffee and a full bowl of water for Murphy. He took the first bite, chewing slowly. The bread was dry, but the peanut butter was smooth, fragrant, with a gentle saltiness, like some forgotten piece of the past was being summoned back through the roof of his mouth. Murphy remained still, eyes half closed, breathing slow. Travis set the coffee down on the windowsill, stood up, and cracked the window open. The early breeze slipped inside, carrying the scent of decayed leaves beneath the vine trellis, and the damp breath of roof tiles still moist from last night's rain. He pulled out his notebook and wrote a few lines. Day, not sure which. Meal, yes. Sleep, will come. Companion, breathing steady in a patch of sun. He added nothing more. Murphy shifted, adjusting his position. There was a soft click as claws touched the floor. Travis leaned down, gently patted his head. I think this place might work for us, Murphy. The oven downstairs crackled faintly. The quiet rhythm of someone tapping the countertop rose through the floorboards like the sound of rain on an old tin roof. Outside, the sky hadn't cleared completely, but the clouds were beginning to lift, tinged with the same shade of pale blue that once wrapped bakery loaves in his mother's shop on the outskirts of town when he was a boy. He sat by the window, picked up the coffee, took a sip. The coffee was thin, but it warmed his throat. The window remained open, and somewhere down the street there came the soft knock of a wooden door, followed by a raspy voice calling a name, or perhaps summoning something else entirely. Not a person, not an event, but something less defined. Murphy opened his eyes. Travis turned his head. And then the second knock came, firmer, closer, like the abandoned house with the message, "Come tomorrow, 9 a.m., had just begun to unlock itself from another side of the story. They headed back into the street at 8:30. Neither of them said a word. The sky was quietly bright, not too blue, but no longer hiding the sun. Murphy stayed close, sometimes lifting his nose to catch the scent of fresh paint from the sign repair shop at the corner, sometimes glancing back when he heard the ring of a bicycle bell in the distance. When they reached the old house at the end of the alley, the wooden door that had once been tightly shut now stood ajar, just enough for a person to slip through. There was no sign, no voices, just a dim interior filled with the smell of damp wood and air that hadn't been touched in years. Travis stepped forward and gently pushed the door open. A long room stretched before him, concrete floor cracked in places, walls mottled with handprints faded by time, and at the center, the remains of a forgotten workshop, tables with broken legs, rusted planers, and a crooked sign hanging heavy with dust. Jonas and Sons, woodcraft since 1945. Travis looked around. No one was there, but to the left, a doorway led to a smaller room. Inside, a sliver of daylight spilled from a broken skylight, falling across an old bamboo table where a simple toolbox lay, hammer, saw, chisel, ruler with its numbers nearly rubbed away. He walked closer. His fingers brushed across the surface. The dust was fine as ash, but the grain beneath still showed clear. He picked up the hammer. The handle was firm. That sensation, the way the grip fit his palm, the weight balanced at the head, wasn't a memory, but something deeper. It was like remembering how to hold your breath underwater after years of forgetting. Murphy sat at the doorway, watching. His tail tapped once. Travis exhaled, set the hammer down, and looked at the wall, where a wooden plaque once hung. Now only the hook remained. An hour later, he returned with a strip of pressed wood and a box of nails. 3 hours after that, the scent of freshly cut timber mixed with the bitter trace of cold coffee from an old paper cup as sunlight angled across the workbench where he carved the first words into the surface. "Welcome back." Carved by hand, not with a machine. Every stroke, every line, pressed into the wood like he was etching the shape of something that had waited too long to be named. Murphy lay beneath the table, head resting on his forepaws, eyes half closed. The afternoon passed the way oil seeps into seasoned wood, slowly, warmly, and with quiet certainty. When the sign was finally complete, Travis lifted it gently and propped it against the front door. He didn't hammer it in. He just let it lean there, as if trusting that some things, when made with enough intention, could hold their place in the world without force. And as the last golden threads of daylight began to blur at the edges of the window pane, a sound stirred just outside. Not loud, but distinct. 3 knocks against the wooden frame, evenly spaced, calm, deliberate. Travis looked up. Murphy stood, ears twitching. Out there, a figure stepped forward, lean frame, canvas jacket creased with wear, a cloth bag in hand filled with scattered tools. He said nothing at first, only looked at the sign that read, "Welcome back," then looked at Travis. "I saw the sign outside yesterday. If there's still room to learn how to make chairs, I'll sweep floors, brew tea, do anything needed." Travis nodded. No questions. They began cleaning. No plan. Just brooms, rags, and warm water. Murphy wandered about, sniffing every corner as if mapping a new territory, not to claim it, but to understand it. By nightfall, the 3 of them sat on the front step, where a slant of streetlight filtered through the broken eave and landed on the newly finished wooden board. The letters, "Welcome back," glowed softly beneath the amber light, like something always meant to be seen this way. The young man sat beside Travis, resting his hands on his knees. "I used to be an apprentice. After the accident," his voice faltered, then stopped entirely. Travis didn't speak. Murphy leaned against his leg, breathing steadily. In the distance, the long, mournful horn of a freight train rolled in low across the town, then faded, like waves breaking against the walls of time. And just as Travis stood to gather the last of the rags, something on the street flickered at the edge of his vision. A faint red light, like the reflection of tail lamps. Yet it made no sound, no mechanical noise, just a hush, a passing. Murphy lifted his head, ears sharp. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He took one slow step toward the doorframe, as though trying to name something his senses knew but language never taught. Travis placed a hand on Murphy's back, paused, then turned his gaze down the street, toward where the light had disappeared like breath against glass. The next morning, they didn't return to the rented room. An old newspaper had been folded and left on the bakery's front stoop, headline in bold ink, "Coldmere Rescue Station to close permanently by month's end." Travis sat down on the wooden steps, a half-eaten sandwich resting idle in his hand, eyes locked on those words as though reading them might undo their weight. Murphy lay at his feet, head on the arch of Travis's boot, looking up with the kind of gaze that still held on to sounds from the night before, sounds unnamed, but not forgotten, That afternoon, Travis walked to the end of the row of warehouses. There, tucked behind overgrown hedges and rusted chain link, stood the rescue station. No gleaming sign, no tiled entryway, no manicured lawn. Just a low, white building, the paint faded yellow at the corners, a roof of warped tin pocked with rust, and a small hand-painted sign that read, "Cold Coats Shelter, since 1999. An elderly woman opened the door. Her hair was snow-white, her hands still covered in rubber gloves, a blue smock marked with strands of fur, and a name tag cracked at the edges. Marlene. "I've seen you in the paper," she said before he could speak, her gaze falling instantly to Murphy's collar. The man with the shepherd. Murphy, wasn't it? Travis nodded. "I want to help. I don't want to see this place close." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes fixed not on his face but on the name tag glinting faintly against the dog's chest. "You understand? It's not just the money. It's the system, worn thin from the inside. It's licenses, inspections, people who believe that the silence of a dog in a cage doesn't deserve to be heard the way a crying child in a ward does." Travis sat on the wooden chair by the entrance. "I'm not here to fight the town. I'm here to keep this place alive. If it needs a new name, fresh paint, someone to sweep floors and sit beside an animal on its first night here, I'll do it." Marlene said nothing at first. She stepped to the side door, pushed it open to reveal the corridor of kennels running parallel. Some barking, some scratching, some lying perfectly still, staring back through iron bars as if watching a world they could no longer reach. Murphy walked slowly past each one, looking. "If you're serious," Marlene said at last, her voice gentler now. "I ask one thing. Don't turn this place into something that makes people feel good about themselves. Turn it into something that makes these dogs feel like they matter." Travis nodded. A week later, the Cold Coats Shelter sign came down. He used the same chisel he had carved "Welcome Back" with, this time pressing into fresh-cut oak from the workshop, sanded smooth, sealed in a thin coat of protective finish, a soft, honey-colored grain catching light like skin catching warmth. The letters were hand-carved, deep and steady, painted white. Murphy's home. The opening day had no ceremony, no red ribbons, no banners, just 7 people, 5 who had once been drifters, 1 retired vet, and Marlene. And there was Murphy, standing by the sign, head slightly tilted as though listening to the wood tell its story in its own slow language. Travis mounted the board above the front gate. And when the sun spilled its last golden light over the freshly replaced roof, catching in the wet sheen of paint not yet dry, a small truck rolled slowly past. The man in the driver's seat lowered the window, paused. He didn't wave. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded, a short, sure nod. Then drove on. Murphy watched him go. Only after the truck disappeared did Travis notice what was hanging on its rear bumper. A hand-lettered sign, the script clumsy but clear. "Adopted by Murphy's home, July delivery." Travis turned to Marlene. "There's already a list?" "Just this morning, 12 dogs." She paused, then added, "One of them had a red cloth tied around its neck. Nothing else. Just that." Murphy stopped walking, raised his head. His ears didn't flick at a sound. No one had called his name. He just stood still, because the light of the late morning had swept across the backyard, bounced off the newly replaced fencing, and landed in his eyes, casting a soft orange hue. Not bright, but warm enough to make him look as though something old had just come home. The next morning, the sunlight came early and clean. Travis rose at 6, filled 2 large canisters with water, wrapped 3 sandwiches in foil, folded them tight. Murphy was already waiting at the door, collar buckled, tail brushing lightly against the frame. Outside, An old pickup truck sat parked at the curb. In the front seat, 2 volunteers, a young man who used to work as a mechanic and a girl with cropped hair, once known for lifting wallets, now keeper of the Saturday morning inventory ledger. In the back of the truck, the bags were packed with quiet care. Fresh loaves of bread, dry dog food, spare leashes, a couple of thin raincoats, and several plastic toys still sealed in their packaging, untouched. Murphy was the first to climb in, springing lightly with his hind legs before settling into the back corner of the truck bed, where a folded wool blanket had been laid out just for him. Travis reached out, placed a hand gently atop Murphy's head. "Let's go, old friend." The first stop was the back street behind Coldmere Market, where 3 men usually slept beneath the weathered stone statue, each curled beside a worn-out duffel and a small dog wrapped tightly against the morning chill. Murphy moved slowly, his paws silent on the wet cement, pausing at each curled figure, pressing his nose gently against the back of each unfamiliar dog, as though offering a quiet morning greeting. None of them barked. One of them, a spotted dog with drooping ears and no tail, rose just slightly, leaned forward, and softly licked Murphy's cheek. The man beside him let out a rough, sandpaper laugh, the kind that comes from deep inside a chest used to smoke and silence. He's never done that with any other dog, man. Travis handed over a bag of bread, and with it, a new collar engraved with a name tag that read, "If lost, return to Murphy's home." The man accepted it, blinking rapidly, not out of emotion, but because the sunlight had angled directly into the corner of his eye, catching him off guard. The second stop was the Southern Park, the one with 6 wooden benches, a broken public water fountain, and an old woman who always sat knitting beneath the sprawling oak tree. She lived with a calico cat named Muffin, whose tail would flick like clockwork when the wind moved through the basket. Murphy didn't bark. He simply walked up, sat close beside her bench, and watched the curled-up cat with a quiet restraint that suggested he understood. This was not his space to claim. Travis offered the old woman a vegetarian meal pack, a small pouch of cat food, and a soft towel imprinted with the shape of a loaf of bread. She said nothing except this: "Your dog has the eyes of someone who's lived long enough to no longer need to shout about anything." And so the Saturday morning passed, like a light wind through open streets. No soundtrack needed, no camera rolling. Just the sound of doors opening, the soft tap of paw pads on pavement, the shy chuckles after each handshake, and the kind of glance that says, "Today, at least, someone remembered I exist." Murphy moved on, weaving through neighborhoods, alleys, and tucked-away corners of town. At one point, he paused in front of a rusted cart, where a little girl sat curled around a small, 3-legged dog, both of them still damp from the storm the night before. Murphy didn't come close. He sat instead, quietly, tilting his head just slightly, his eyes fixed on the red cloth tied around the smaller dog's neck. A cloth now faded, frayed at the edges, but knotted with care that had lasted through the rain. Travis knelt down beside the girl. "Are you hungry?" She nodded, but didn't lift her head. Travis opened the bag, took out a cheese sandwich, wrapped it together with a thin raincoat, and handed them both to her. Murphy still hadn't looked away from the small, injured dog. When the truck finally turned back toward Murphy's home, Travis glanced in the mirror. The girl was still there, still holding her dog tightly, but now with most of the sandwich gone from her hand. The red cloth around the little dog's neck fluttered faintly in the wind. Murphy didn't turn around, but his tail tapped the truck bed, twice, slow and deliberate. The sun had grown harsh by the time they neared home. Travis pulled over, reached into the small wooden box by the driver's seat, and pulled out a freshly cut plank, its surface still fragrant with glue, edges unpainted. He placed it across his lap, took out a pocket knife, and carved quickly across the grain. "Saturday Tales. We'll be back next week." Murphy laid his chin gently on Travis's knee and closed his eyes. Mornings at the workshop always began the same way, with the slow groan of the metal door being lifted, the creak of old wood beneath worn soles, and the gentle tapping of Murphy's claws against the floor, echoing like the soft chime of a bell, announcing the start of something sacred. He always waited at the threshold, not to guard, but to signal, in his quiet way, that the place was open, ready, and willing to receive whatever pieces of people might still be broken. Travis arrived early, always the first one in, but Murphy was always there before him. No one ever quite knew what time Murphy left his bed. They only knew that by the time the first strip of morning light spilled across the front wall, Murphy was already seated in his usual spot on the left side of the wooden porch, spine straight, eyes fixed on the entrance, as though silently counting the souls yet to arrive. They began their day like any other, wiping down machines, replacing saw blades, organizing wood by size and shape. The first to arrive was Darren, a man with arms covered in tattoos, once deep in drink, now learning to build a coffee table for the sister who'd just come home from the hospital. He never greeted anyone out loud, but always bent down to scratch Murphy's head. "Better than yesterday, huh?" he murmured, voice raw like gravel scraping a pipe. Murphy didn't respond, not in any way that spoke aloud, but he closed his eyes for a beat, then tilted his head ever so slightly, like nodding. Next came Julia, a girl whose shoes had worn down at the heel, but who always carried a pencil tucked behind her ear. She didn't come to build, only to sketch, to draw little designs for others to follow. Julia didn't say much to people, but on her first day she sat beside Murphy for half an hour without moving, just drawing in her notebook. Ever since, she left a new drawing in the wooden basket near the porch each morning, right where Murphy liked to lie. "I don't know if you get these, Murphy," she once whispered, "but everyone starts with a square." And one afternoon, a boy no older than 12, the son of the bottle collector who worked the corner, walked by, spotted Murphy resting on the steps, and quietly turned back. He gently set an already opened snack pack down in front of him, then darted off without a word. Murphy didn't eat it. He nudged it into the gift basket with his nose, leaving it there like a thank you note written in silence. The more people came, the fewer felt the need to speak right away. They just sat beside Murphy. And when one of them finally began telling a story, not their own, but always a friend's, the others followed, their voices flowing like sawdust spilling from the first cut of the day. One afternoon, Travis looked up from the table, saw them, seated in a quiet circle around something. As he approached, he saw Murphy curled at the center, head resting on a pillow Julia had sewn from leftover scraps. Someone had draped a small towel over his back, like a child's blanket. No one spoke. They simply sat, tools in hand, rulers, chisels, pencils, and their eyes had softened, stilled. As the sun dipped below the edge of the roof, its light streamed sideways through the round window, casting Murphy's silhouette against the far wall. A dog in stillness, framed by gold, unspeaking, unmoving, yet more present than any voice could be. His shape quietly marked the day's turning point, before you entered and after you chose to stay. That night, Travis hung a small sign just inside the workshop door, hand-carved. "If you need to breathe, come sit with him." No name, no explanation. But everyone knew who him meant. And as dusk settled, as each person drifted out with a finished drawing, a carved block, or a burden lightened ever so slightly, Murphy remained at the doorway. Travis came over, laid a hand gently on his head, and sat beside him. "You heard all of it, didn't you?" Murphy didn't move, but his tail tapped, just once. Far down the street, the soft glow of a small car appeared again. The same pale red, the same quiet roll through shadow. but this time it lingered longer. And when Travis stepped forward to get a better look, the passenger door opened just a crack, just enough for the light inside to outline a figure sitting still. No one stepped out. No words were spoken. Only a slow, deliberate nod. Then the door closed. The car rolled on, leaving behind nothing but a soft line of light stretching beneath the street lamp. Murphy didn't move. His eyes followed until the curve at the end of the street swallowed the glow whole. 3 days later, Travis sat in a small room lined with aged wooden planks and a few hanging pots of dried plants swaying gently near the window. The ceiling was high, though cracked and flaking, and the chairs had been arranged in a half circle, all facing a makeshift wooden platform pieced together from 2 upturned paint buckets. Beside him sat a plastic cup of water, and pressed close against his leg, with its head resting gently across the back of his left hand, was Murphy. Silent, steady, present. The session didn't begin with applause. It began with the sound of a metal door sliding open and a few chairs shifting softly across the floor. "You can start whenever you're ready," a middle-aged woman in a dark knitted cardigan said quietly. Travis didn't rise. He remained seated in the front row and slowly turned to face the rest of the room. 8 people in total. The oldest wore a faded beanie, hands thin, fingers bare to the bone. The youngest was a frail boy, still in a jacket bearing the faded logo of an old outreach program. No one spoke. Travis tightened his fingers slightly around Murphy's fur, then began, with a single, plain sentence. "I once lost everything." No reaction. Every gaze stayed still, as though waiting, not for drama, not for inspiration, but for something true. He continued, voice steady and unembellished, like wood receiving the first draw of a carving blade. "The house burned down. My wife passed 6 months before that. No insurance, no family left, and no reason to keep going. I figured if one morning I just didn't get up anymore, no one would even know." His hand brushed softly across Murphy's neck, thicker now, stronger than it had been on that first day beneath basement 12. But one night, during a heavy rain, I was in that old basement, holding on to the last half of a loaf of bread, and saw something lying in the dark. No sound, no movement. It didn't crawl away. It just looked at me, a look that asked for nothing. It simply stayed. A woman seated to the left blinked slowly. Travis didn't glance toward her. His eyes stayed somewhere in the space between his words. "I tore the bread in 2. For the first time in months, I shared something with someone. Not because I was kind, but because I didn't want to be the last person eating in a world that felt emptier every day." He spoke of the old coat, of that first night sleeping side by side, of the new name tag, of Murphy's first ever steak dinner at a restaurant no one imagined would serve 2 soaked and road-worn strays. No one interrupted, no phones buzzed, no chairs creaked under restless weight. Only Travis's voice filled the space. And with each word, it was as if people sat up straighter, not because they were touched, but because his story had reached a memory they'd hidden, a pain they'd never framed. "I'm not here to share some touching tale. I don't believe in miracles, but I do believe in a moment, when someone or something stops because of you, doesn't ask, doesn't expect, just offers a look, like the one Murphy gave me that night. And if I had turned away, maybe I'd still be alive, but I would have stopped being myself." He didn't say anything more. Murphy stood now, leaned in, and gently placed both front paws on Travis's knees. The room remained silent. There was no applause. But an older man seated at the far edge of the circle reached out and rested a hand softly on the shoulder of the boy next to him, then said, voice low and steady, "I once had one like that too. The boy nodded, his eyes still fixed on Murphy. Travis rose, bowed slightly in a quiet gesture of thanks, and gathered the leash in one hand. As they reached the door, the woman running the program stepped over. "We've got another session next week. East Park. Do you think you could come?" Travis didn't answer immediately. He looked to Murphy, whose gaze lifted, tail swayed gently, like a silent agreement spoken not in words, but in certainty. They stepped outside. It wasn't quite dark yet. The sunlight still stretched across the tops of the row houses. But at the foot of the hill, where the bronze-colored gate of Murphy's home gleamed under the fading glow of day, someone was sitting. Not standing, but seated directly on the ground, arms wrapped around a small wooden box held closely to her chest. Murphy saw her first, and he stopped. It was a woman. A rough canvas coat, cropped silver hair, no makeup, no hint of jewelry or the luxury of idle time. But the way she placed the wooden box on her lap, the way her hand moved over its lid as if touching something more valuable than words could hold, made Travis slow his steps. Murphy didn't blink. "I'm looking for a place for this," she said. Not pleading, not dramatic, simply offering a sentence that had been waiting to be spoken for several days. Travis sat beside her without asking. He let a few seconds pass, filled only by the sound of wind in the leaves and the soft clink of Murphy's tag brushing against his collar ring. "It's Max's Ashes," she continued. "My first dog. My husband passed last year. Max held on another 8 months. Then he went too. I thought about scattering him in the backyard, but something in me said no. Maybe because that place was too quiet, and Max was never a quiet dog." Murphy stepped forward, gently rested his head on her leg. He didn't sniff. He didn't bark. He just rested. Still, anchored, listening. "I read about this place," she said, voice softer now. "Murphy's home. Sounds like a house, but not the kind built for people. More like the kind where the things we can't name anymore might still find a place." Travis placed a hand on the box, ran his fingers over its simple grain, then asked, "Would you like him to be part of the memorial corner?" She shook her head. "Number, I don't need a nameplate. I don't need stone. I just want Max to be somewhere a dog once reminded someone their life still meant something. In a place like that, I think he could stay. As a small part of something larger. Warmer." Murphy sat. The breeze rippled through his coat, lifted a few dry leaves scattered across the concrete path. 3 weeks later, a new wooden bench was placed beneath the large oak in the center of the park. The same spot where Travis and Murphy had once taken shelter from their first shared storm. The bench wasn't new, not exactly. Travis had handpicked each old piece from the storage room, wood once part of headboards, stair rails, discarded tabletops, then sanded, joined, glued, and stained them one by one. No modern bolts, no industrial polish, only the traces of hand saws, layers of wood glue, and small scratches preserved like the scars of a story that no longer needed to be hidden. Under the bench, carved in simple block lettering, clean and undecorated, it read, "For the dog who reminded me that I still mattered to this world." Soon, people from the neighborhood began arriving earlier each morning. Some of the elderly chose to sit there instead of the cold concrete benches by the playground. A few children read books beneath the tree's shade. And sometimes someone would sit down, run their hand gently along the bench's surface, as if touching something familiar they couldn't quite name. Murphy always sat at the front of the bench whenever they came to the park, never climbing onto the seat, never sprawling lazily on the grass, just sitting upright, tail resting lightly against the ground, eyes fixed on the path that stretched from the eastern high-rises, as if waiting not for someone in particular, but for a presence long imprinted in memory. One day, a boy of about 7 ran over, dropped beside Murphy, and pulled from his jacket pocket a bone-shaped biscuit, holding it like a treasure too small for ceremony. "You know," he said, his voice quiet in that way children sometimes speak when they're repeating things grown-ups say but don't fully understand, "my grandpa had one just like you. But he's gone now." Murphy lifted his head, ears tilting towards the sound. "Mom said he cried when he had to scatter the ashes. She cried too, but she told me, if there's a place where people leave the things they can't hold on to anymore, then maybe sadness can soften there. Just a little." The boy broke the biscuit in 2, one half placed gently in his own palm, the other in Murphy's. Murphy ate, slowly, without urgency. Then, with the same unhurried grace, he leaned forward and licked the boy's hand. Not out of appetite, not for show, but in the quiet way one soul acknowledges another. From a distance, Travis watched, the sunlight catching on the lawn and setting the base of the oak tree ablaze with an amber glow, like the lingering warmth of a fire that never needed fuel, only memory. And in that moment, no one moved too quickly. Then, from the path leading into the park, a man appeared. He wasn't hurrying. In one hand, he carried a slender wooden case, its surface carved with a strange emblem, the image of a broken collar, the clasp split, but the 2 ends bound together by a thin thread of red. Murphy turned his head. Travis saw it too, but didn't step forward just yet. The man didn't speak. He sat on a bench a few steps away from the oak, rested the wooden case on his lap, opened it slowly, and drew from within a small plaque made of brass, not polished, not ornate, just 4 lines of hand-etched text, the lettering slanted gently to the right. "No one saves anyone. Sometimes we just both need a place to begin again." 4. Murphy Coldmere Animal Welfare Committee Companion of the Year. Murphy approached without barking. His gaze held no alarm, only a steady, unwavering curiosity fixed on the man's hands, hands marked with dry calluses that spoke of hammers once lifted, chains once pulled, and trust once anchored in something quieter than faith. The man looked up at Travis. "I don't represent any organization," he said, voice worn but steady. "I'm just someone who once wrote a reference letter for a dog no one wanted. But today, I've been asked to deliver this as a thank you from the people who aren't here but who have changed because of the 2 of you." Travis walked forward, took the plaque, said nothing. Murphy turned his head, tail flicking once, as the sunlight reached across the park and landed squarely in the palm of Travis's hand, right where the plaque now rested. The ceremony took place on a Friday afternoon, in a plain room at the back of the city library. There was no podium, no camera crew, but there was a semicircle of wooden chairs, a round table draped in deep blue cloth, and a white ribbon threaded through a small medal. Circular, engraved with the imprint of a paw cradled inside a pair of open hands. Murphy sat still at the center of the room. Not anxious, not restrained, just present, as if he understood perfectly that his being there today was not a coincidence, but a quiet culmination. A woman with silver-gray hair, the representative of the Welfare Committee, stepped forward with a microphone. "We don't award this title every year," she said, "only when someone, or something, leaves a mark deep enough to alter the behavior of those around them. Not with speeches, not with fame, but by simply existing in a way that changes how others live." She looked down at Murphy, then at Travis. "And for the first time, we're not giving it to a person." Travis stepped forward, bowed slightly. She handed him the medal, not as part of a formal gesture, but with both hands open, the way someone might pass on something that's been held for years, waiting for the right person to continue its story. He knelt, fastened the ribbon around Murphy's neck, and in that small, deliberate motion, one that didn't seek applause or definition. He felt, perhaps for the first time in his life, what it meant to give something meaningful to a being who needed no titles, no history, but somehow had made him feel he'd never walked alone. "We made it through," he whispered, the words catching on something tight in his throat, like wind slipping between chords. Murphy rested his head on Travis's knee. No one clapped, but eyes lit up, and a few were quietly wiped with the back of a hand. That night, Travis didn't go home right away. He walked with Murphy through the old part of town, turned down the narrow path leading to the river's edge. There, a new bench had been installed. No engraving, no inscription, just a small ceramic emblem. The silhouette of an upright ear, and beside it, a tiny paw resting in the curve of a hand. Murphy sat at the stone step nearby, the breeze from the water brushing past them like the breath of a story no longer needing to be told. Travis sat beside him, reached into his pocket, pulled out a small object, a frayed strip of leather, still hooked to a round clasp. The red thread around the break was still there, but now, carved into the surface with a small knife, was a single sentence. "If tomorrow changes everything, then today is still the first day we walked together." Murphy tilted his head. And just then, from the far side of the street, headlights swept across the edge of the sidewalk, not aimed directly at them, but reflected from the glass of an old building, streaking across the ground and pausing, for just a breath, at the path that led to the workshop. Travis stood. Murphy didn't wait for a command. They walked toward the light together. The sky hadn't darkened fully yet, but the shadows of the trees had stretched across the brick road, trailing along the cracks like a slow unraveling of day. Not an ending, but a return. A soft retracing of steps once taken hesitantly, but never regretted. The workshop door stood ajar, spilling warm gold light across the threshold. Not harsh, not sharp, but the kind that softens the outlines of things and makes even dust look like memory. Murphy stepped in first, tail brushing lightly against the floor, more like a breeze than motion. Travis followed, still holding the object in his palm, the brass tag bearing Murphy's name, taken off after the ceremony not to preserve it, but because he had always intended to place it somewhere else, with his own hands. In the center of the room, a group of young people were assembling a bookshelf. A boy struggled to hold the frame upright. A girl checked the glue, and the silver-haired woman Travis had once seen at the park stood nearby, her gloves still on, her face streaked faintly with sawdust. When Travis and Murphy stepped in, no one was surprised. Only one person, the bespectacled boy by the window, looked up and said softly, "We thought maybe you weren't coming back tonight." Travis shook his head, smiled faintly. There's still more to share. Murphy passed the line of chairs and stopped before a blank wall, where a wooden notice board had been mounted, nothing pinned to it yet except 2 handwritten notes and a single brass paperclip. Travis stepped forward and pulled the name tag from his pocket. He fixed it onto the top corner of the board, the highest, most visible spot, using a small wooden nail engraved with a barely noticeable letter M. No one said a word, but every gaze came to rest on that spot, as though they had just witnessed something far more significant than any grand ceremony. The sky had darkened. Small lights flickered on along the walls, casting a gentle warmth over the wood grain that lined the room. From a dusty old radio came the faint hum of jazz, wordless, without crescendo, just a soft, wavering stream of notes, like ripples across still water, enough to gently fill the quiet spaces between the scrape of wood planes and the pull of hand saws. Murphy had returned to the long bench near the doorway. Travis sat beside him, his hand gliding down from between the ears to the base of the neck, a familiar motion that had become a habit, not because it changed anything, but because it didn't have to. What they were sitting inside was not new and didn't need to be. It had been built layer by layer, with every halved loaf of bread, every soaked coat, every directionless step that halted, only because a pair of waiting eyes had made stillness feel like purpose. "We shared this," Travis said softly, not to any person in particular, but to the space itself, to the bench beneath them, to every fragmented thing that had once lay scattered and had since been gently pieced back into something strong enough for others to lean against. Murphy didn't bark. He didn't shift his gaze from the door. Outside, the sun had fully disappeared, but a thin layer of amber light still pressed against the window pane, highlighting the silhouette of someone approaching. That figure paused for a moment before gently pushing the door open. It was a boy. In his hand, he held a drawing, made with crayons, the lines unsteady and childlike. The picture showed a man sitting beneath an overhang, and beside him a dog with a curled tail and wide eyes without pupils, just two bright circles. "Are you the man in the picture?" the boy asked, still holding up his drawing, voice steady but full of quiet hope. Travis didn't have time to answer. Murphy had already walked forward, and the boy knelt down and placed a hand on Murphy's head. Not with hesitation, not with fear, but with the kind of instinctive ease that suggested that hand had known that exact place for a very long time. The room fell completely silent. And in that moment, the square window at the far end of the workshop caught the reflection of the streetlight outside, casting a long shadow across the floor. A shadow not quite shaped like anything precise, but with a long tail and a stance that seemed to be waiting for someone to call it back. The next day, like every other afternoon, Travis returned to the park. Murphy walked on his left. The steps were even, the tail swayed gently, and each time they passed beneath the oak tree, he would pause. Not to sniff, not to lie down, but just long enough to take one deep breath, as though trying to collect the fading scent of a memory dissolving into the wind. The breeze was soft. The oak leaves were falling earlier than usual. Couples still sat together on the benches like they always had. Children still ran with their kites across the wide, grassy stretch. And the old man selling cotton candy still kept his cart in the same place, his prices unchanged for 5 years. Everything seemed untouched. But only those who had once lost everything could recognize that what doesn't change is, in itself, a gift. A man who once built cabinets, who once sat in a cold basement and tore a sandwich in two for a pair of eyes that asked for nothing, now lived above an old bakery. The small room still held onto its pale green curtains, faded by sunlight. On the nightstand was a glass jar filled with folded slips of paper, each one capturing a sentence, a Saturday morning moment. Some were dusted with crumbs, others folded into tiny stars. Each morning, Travis still ate toast with peanut butter, sipped weak tea, and rested his legs by the window. Murphy lay across the wool rug, one ear perked up as though listening for the voice of the newspaper vendor down the street. People still knocked on the workshop door. There were still those who came, sat down, and shared their stories, not always in words, but in the way their hands trembled, in the creak of saws against wood, in the long pauses that said more than sentences ever could. There were still visitors who came just to stroke Murphy's back, to place a biscuit gently in front of him and sit silently, asking nothing, saying nothing. And there were still afternoons like this one, when Travis and Murphy crossed the park, paused beneath the old oak, and sat once again on the bench carved with the words, "For the dog who reminded me that I still mattered to this world." No one read the line out loud, but many stopped, placed a quiet hand on the bench's armrest, and then walked on, as if they had just received something invisible, yet whole enough to keep. Travis never accepted television invitations. He never appeared in national news. He turned down offers to move into the newly sponsored housing project and declined every check labeled as a chance to change your life. Because for him, life had already changed. In that exact moment when a black nose touched half a loaf of bread beneath a flickering basement light. A small gesture between two lost creatures. A trust that was never demanded, yet freely given. And when people sometimes asked why he never told the full story, why he didn't seize it as an inspirational opportunity, Travis would simply smile. A soft, passing smile like a breeze through an open autumn window, and reply, "I once shared half a loaf of bread with something abandoned, and somehow both of us were saved." And just beneath him, Murphy would give his wrist a single lick. Not hurried, not showy, just one quiet touch, as if to confirm that every word just spoken was true, and still unfolding, day by day. On another fall afternoon, Travis pinned a handwritten note to the workshop board. "We don't teach trades here, we just learn how to begin again. Together." Murphy lay beneath it, head resting on the old rug, and when the back door creaked open to welcome someone new, the light from the street stretched across the wooden floor, like a sunbeam gently insisting, "This story isn't over." In the quiet little town of Ridgway Hollow, a girl named Leora lived peacefully with her grandfather and a German shepherd named Sentinel, once a trained K9. Every morning, Sentinel walked beside her to the bus stop, like a gentle ritual. But on one crisp autumn day, as the bus doors opened, Sentinel suddenly lunged forward, pulling Leora to the ground among fallen maple leaves. Just seconds later, things long buried began to surface. A bus with no trace, dreams that felt too real, and memories that didn't come from stories. What had Sentinel awakened? And why did he always seem to know what was coming? Mornings in Ridgway Hollow always began with a gentle kind of stillness. Not the kind that felt empty, but the kind that made people pause, take a deep breath, and listen. Listen to the wind brushing over rusted tin roofs. Listen to the chirps of young birds beneath nearly bare oak trees. And farther away, the steady hum of a waterfall threading through rock crevices, soft but as rhythmic as a clock breathing in time with the heart of this little town. At the southern edge of Ridgway, where no road signs existed and nobody needed GPS to find their way, stood the quiet house where Leora lived with her grandfather. Locals called it the Golden Corner, not because the house was painted yellow, but because every afternoon the sun poured over the hillside, hitting the tin roof and worn wooden fence just right, soaking the whole house in an old honeyed light that made time seem slower by decades. Leora was 13, slender and quiet, much like the town itself, unhurried, unspoken, yet holding something deeper beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. She couldn't remember the last time she laughed out loud. Her memories had blurred ever since that day when a police car pulled up in front of her grandmother's house in another state, carrying a brown folder and a single sentence. There were no survivors. Her parents died in a suspension bridge collapse in a faraway state. The news called it a structural failure, but to a child, no explanation could change the fact that no one was ever coming home again. Her grandfather was the only one left. Not a good cook, clueless about social media, but someone who knew how to warm a broken heart with hand-knitted scarves and a porch light that was always left on when Leora got home late from school. Sentinel arrived on a day draped in drizzle, an unmarked truck parked in front of the house. The driver handed over a stack of paperwork and spoke only 3 lines. Retired from duty, certified transfer, no returns. Then he left, just as suddenly as he came. On the wet wooden porch stood a German shepherd, older than Leora had imagined, but steady. His coat was dark and sleek, rain-soaked but not shivering. His amber gold eyes weren't searching. They were simply waiting. as if he knew this was the final stop on a long, silent journey. At first, Leora didn't know what to call him. "Bruno?" she tried. No reaction. "Max?" He blinked. "Sentinel?" And with that, he gently raised his head, took one step toward her, and sat. The name wasn't in the documents, but from that moment on, no one ever called him anything else. Sentinel never barked. He didn't ask to be petted, but he was always exactly where he needed to be. In the morning, he waited by the bathroom sink as Leora brushed her teeth. In the afternoon, he sat beneath the porch steps when she unpacked her school bag. At night, he lay beside her bed, quiet as shadow, only shifting slightly when a truck rumbled through the sleeping town. Her grandfather once said, "This dog, he's not like the others." Then added softly, "He walks like he's remembering old paths." Leora nodded. She felt it too. There was something in Sentinel that anchored her, not in the cheerful way of a playful pet, but in the quiet certainty that, whatever happened, Sentinel would never leave his post. The file that came with him stated that Sentinel had once served as part of a military K-9 unit, over 7 years of service, retired due to a shift in defense training objectives. Leora didn't fully understand what that meant, but she understood the faded scar behind his left ear, and the way he watched every stranger through the window, not with curiosity, but with evaluation. She never had to teach him to sit or walk beside her. He just did. When she read, Sentinel curled beneath the chair. When she opened the back door, he stepped out first, always glancing left, then right, like clearing blind spots. Ridgeway Hollow was small enough for everyone to know everyone, and small enough that anything unusual turned into town gossip overnight. When Sentinel first appeared, some were wary. "A K-9? Trained for lethal commands, maybe?" someone whispered at the bakery. But a few weeks later, when Sentinel silently stepped between the florist and a panicked wild deer, everything changed. He didn't bark, he didn't lunge, he just stood, calm and steady, until the deer bolted past without harming a soul. From that day, people called him Leora's Sentinel. But only Leora truly knew. Sentinel wasn't just a companion. There were nights when she dreamt of running water, flashing ambulance lights, distant voices calling through a haze. Sentinel never barked, but he was always there, right when she jolted awake, forehead damp with sweat. There was one thing Leora had never told her grandfather, and perhaps didn't have the courage to believe fully herself, that she often felt Sentinel knew more than he let on. Not just commands, but emotions. One time she sat still for hours after looking through old photos of her mother. Sentinel didn't move. But the moment she sighed and folded the picture away, he gently rested his head on her leg, as if to say, "That's enough. Let me carry that sorrow for you, just for a while." And then, the next day came. A day like any other, seemingly no different, when the sky remained softly gray, the clouds hung quiet, and the wind moved across the hill as it always did. But somewhere, something was waiting. And Sentinel, just like every other morning, sat at the porch steps, amber eyes fixed on Leora's every footstep. Only this time, there was something more in that gaze. Not memory, not instinct, but readiness. As if Sentinel had already seen what was approaching. Something only those who had walked through the battlegrounds of memory could ever truly sense. Morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, slipping past the crimson maple leaves hanging just outside, casting a faint golden veil across the old wooden floor like a tablecloth nature had gently laid down without thinking. At the breakfast table, her grandfather reached for the coffee pot, while Leora quietly placed 2 slices of toast onto a blue-rimmed porcelain plate. Under the table, Sentinel lay still, not asleep, not moving, simply watching, as though memorizing every subtle movement inside the home he had begun to treat as his post of silent vigilance. Ridgeway Hollow welcomed autumn in its own muted way, not in the rush of city seasons, not in the bold colors of the northern mountains. Here, autumn ripened lightly at the treetops, drifted down in thin layers beneath people's feet, and quietly traveled with the wind into each narrow lane. Maple Street, the road Leora walked each morning to reach the bus stop, was now blanketed in leaves. With every step, her canvas shoes made a soft, rustling sound, like a clumsy but comforting soundtrack to the start of another day. "Go straight to the Elm Crossing. Watch the puddle near the second lamppost," her grandfather called gently from the porch, like he always did. Leora nodded, slung her bag over her shoulder, and began to walk. Sentinel stood up as well, without being called, without needing command. He stepped in on her left side, matching her pace like the rhythm had been set years ago. The town, at that hour, was still rubbing its eyes awake. A few shop doors remained shut. Some wooden doors cracked open just enough to let the yellow kitchen light spill through. The maple trees lining both sides of the street swayed lightly, releasing swirls of red, gold, and late-season brown leaves, almost as if someone were scattering quiet blessings along their path. People in town had grown used to seeing Leora with Sentinel. They often gave a small nod, then continued with their routines. Perhaps the image had become too familiar. A brown-haired girl with a low ponytail, always quiet, and a large dog walking beside her. Never ahead, never behind, as if the two weren't just sharing a path, but a single thought. Mr. Porter, the owner of the old bookstore on the corner, stood at his doorway, sweeping leaves. "Morning, little patrol team," he called out. Sentinel paused for a beat, offering a glance in response. Leora gave a soft smile and a nod before moving on. Everything looked familiar. Sounded familiar. Even the air felt unchanged. But Leora sensed something was ever so slightly different. Not clearly in the weather, perhaps in the way Sentinel's breathing felt more even than usual. At one point he glanced over his shoulder. Not out of panic, not out of caution, just as though confirming something intangible, a strange breeze, a quiet shift in the sound of falling leaves. The bus stop stood at the corner of Maple and 6th, a weathered white sign with faded black letters that read, "Bus Stop," swaying gently as if to remind passers-by that time in Ridgeway wasn't a straight line, but a soft loop. The long bench made of pine, old but clean, was where Leora usually waited for a few minutes before the bus arrived. But today, she didn't sit. Sentinel stood beside her, ears slightly perked, eyes trained down the street where the bus usually appeared. Suddenly, the wind picked up. Leaves began to whirl into small, spinning circles across the pavement, like someone painting invisible symbols with a palette of autumn's last colors. Leora raised her hand to keep her hood from slipping, stepping lightly to the left to avoid the gust, and for a moment she noticed how the angled sunlight filtered through the thinning canopy. Gentle, not harsh, casting a faint sheen over everything, like a pane of memory quietly lowered over the day. Sentinel stepped forward once. His front paws landed softly, almost as if measuring the tremor beneath the earth. There was no sound, no bus horn, no engine hum, yet he never took his eyes off the empty street ahead. "The bus isn't here yet," Leora whispered, not to get a response, but just to fill the silence. Sentinel didn't react. She bent down and placed her hand on Sentinel's neck, a familiar gesture, just like every other morning. But today, his coat felt taut. The muscles beneath his fur quivered, not from cold, but as if some fine, unseen field of electricity was stirring in the air, something only Sentinel could sense. Leora looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. The newspaper delivery boy had just turned the corner and waved from a distance. An elderly woman pushed her egg cart past the street corner, one wheel wobbling exactly the same way it always did. Everything appeared the same. But Sentinel was not. He didn't sit down like he usually did, nor did he ease into the calm rhythm of the morning. Instead, his stance remained firm, his head tilted slightly, ears tuned toward the end of the road, as if he was listening for a sound that wasn't meant for human ears. And in that moment, Leora suddenly understood. Perhaps Sentinel had never just been the dog who walked her to the bus stop every morning. He had been guarding something, not for fun, but because something, hidden behind the familiar, still hadn't revealed itself, and the leaves kept falling. The wind kept blowing. Maple Street was as beautiful as ever. But Sentinel, like a half-closed door, stood waiting for something to touch the threshold, to sound the alarm. The low hum of an engine drifted from the far end of the street, a sound every child in Ridgeway Hollow could recognize without even turning their head. It was the steady whine of the school bus, old, yellowed, and always on time, as though even it had grown accustomed to the habits of this town. Leora stood up straight. Her backpack weighed heavy on her shoulders, and her coat was zipped up to the neck. This morning's wind was sharper than usual. Sentinel stood beside her, just like always. But this time, he didn't step forward when she approached the curb. His gaze tightened, tail lowered, ears sharp and still. His whole body was locked in place, the only movement being the slow rise and fall of his chest. The bus approached slowly, unhurried. But from the moment it appeared, Leora felt that something was wrong. She couldn't explain it. Everything looked right, the same turn, the same engine hum, the same soft hiss of brakes. But the air felt wrong. Like all the sounds were muffled under a thick pane of glass, making them slightly distorted. The bus door opened with a long hiss. No greeting, no horn, no familiar glance from the silver-haired driver Leora waved to every morning. Instead, a man wearing a baseball cap and dark sunglasses sat motionless behind the wheel. His gaze, or whatever was behind the glasses, was fixed straight ahead, unmoving, unblinking, not even acknowledging the girl standing just a few steps from the door. Leora stepped forward. Sentinel didn't move. She took another step, her foot landing on the first stair of the bus, and in that instant, Sentinel lunged. There was no bark, no warning, just a sudden jolt, like time tearing in half. She felt her coat rip sharply from behind. Her body flew backward, slamming onto the gravel shoulder. Pain flared through her scraped knee and numbed her left arm where it struck the concrete, but she turned her head immediately. Some instinct told her Sentinel wouldn't act like that without reason. He stood in front of her now, lowered into a defensive stance, his body crouched like he was preparing to charge into something unseen. But he didn't growl, didn't even glance at her. His eyes were locked on the driver behind the glass, where a second ago nothing seemed wrong, but now, Leora noticed something deeply off. The driver hadn't moved, not a turn of the head, not a shift of the shoulder, not even a blink. A figure sat frozen like a wax sculpture inside a driver's uniform. And the face behind those sunglasses. Now, up close, it looked like a mask. No wrinkles, no clear shape of a nose, just flat planes, like someone had tried to render a human face in software and forgot to add the details. Then the bus doors slammed shut, automatically, without touch. The vehicle rolled away slowly, without a horn, without a word, without anyone calling back. It turned onto 6th Street and disappeared behind the maple trees, leaving a stillness in its wake that didn't belong to any ordinary morning. Leora didn't get up. Not from pain, but from the chill along her spine. Not the chill of morning wind, but the kind that comes from a single echoing question. If Sentinel hadn't pulled her back? Where would she be right now? Sentinel turned his head. His gaze had softened, but not completely. He walked slowly to her side and gently licked her wrist, a quiet apology. But in his eyes there was no guilt, only vigilance, and something deeper, like the return of an old memory. A sharp exhale broke the silence. It was Mr. Porter, the bookstore owner, running towards them from behind. "I saw it! I saw it clearly! That dog, it saved her! There was something wrong with that bus." Then came 2 or 3 others, rushing out from nearby homes after hearing the commotion. A woman knelt beside Leora, asking if she was hurt. A man was already calling the school office. But all the noise felt distant to Leora, like she was drifting inside a dream shaped too closely like real life. A red-haired boy whispered, "She fell because of the dog." And the elderly woman with the market cart clucked her tongue, murmuring, "Strange. I've never seen that bus before." 10 minutes later, the police arrived. A young officer named Roden asked her a few questions, then went quiet when he heard the details. No license plate, no reaction, automated door, blank face. "You're sure the driver wasn't someone you recognized?" Leora only looked toward Sentinel, then nodded, not to confirm, but to signal that Sentinel had seen something none of them could. The story spread quickly across town. Not through newspapers, but through morning coffee chats, whispered barbershop exchanges, and glances that lingered just a little longer each time someone walked past Maple Street. No one knew where the bus had come from, and no one could find it listed in the school's official transport logs. From that day on, every time Leora passed that corner, Sentinel walked closer to her side. Not out of fear, but because something was being rewritten by an invisible hand, and Sentinel was the first to feel the pen begin to move, and his eyes, clear beneath the morning sun, had never looked forward quite like they did that day, as if the next bus wouldn't be coming from any street, but from a place where memory had no name. That afternoon, sunlight slanted through the living room window, casting broken patterns across the dark wool rug. The scent of cinnamon from her grandfather's fresh pot of tea floated in the air, but neither of them spoke. Leora sat on the couch, her knee wrapped carefully in gauze and tape. Sentinel lay at her feet, eyes open, ears twitching now and then. The old laptop sat on the coffee table, its screensaver glowing with rows of tiny gray icons. Her grandfather turned in his chair and exhaled deeply. "Carol just sent the footage from the front door camera," he said, his voice steady but low. "We should take a look." Leora nodded. The video began. No music, no effects, just a familiar morning frame. Maple Street, scattered in leaves, Leora stepping out of the house, Sentinel close at her side. As the footage reached the corner, the motion slowed, almost as if the camera itself sensed something was off. The school bus entered the frame. Still yellow, still weathered, but unnaturally stiff. The door opened. And then, the strange began to show. "Pause it here," her grandfather said, hitting stop just as the driver came into view. The man sat motionless behind the windshield, but as he dragged the timeline slower, both of them held their breath. The driver's face, partially hidden by sunglasses and a cap, lacked any sign of life. No blinking, no motion, no muscular response of any kind. And as the image zoomed in, Leora spotted something odd near the edge of his face. A slight shift, like something layered had been applied, then blurred across several frames. "There, you see that?" she pointed. "Right here. Like a glitched digital mask." "Like a video glitch, but not from a bad file," her grandfather whispered. The footage continued. Sentinel lunged, Leora was pulled to the ground. Then came the moment the bus drove away, not fast, not slow, But the most unsettling part was how the driver never once looked down. No flinch, no reaction. Nothing human. "He's not real. Right, Grandpa?" she asked softly. He didn't answer immediately. He turned away, rested his hand on his forehead, shoulders weighted with thought. The room fell silent. Only the soft ticking of the wall clock filled the space. Sentinel never looked away from the screen, as if waiting for a command, or a confirmation he had known all along. "You know," her grandfather said slowly, "after the war, I used to hear stories about the hollow faces. Back then, people whispered about things that imitated humans, but never really understood how to act like one. Like robots? Number worse, like an unfinished version of something trying to become human but never grasping the soul." Leora tightened her fingers. Her heartbeat was normal, but something underneath it smoldered, not quite fear, but the quiet knowing that Sentinel hadn't reacted out of reflex, but from memory, as if he had seen it before, or had been trained to respond to exactly that kind of thing. She leaned down and looked into Sentinel's eyes. There was no panic, no tremble, but it no longer felt like the gaze of a domestic animal. It was the gaze of a soldier, alert, calculating, already preparing for whatever came next. "Grandpa," Sentinel knew something was coming. "I'm sure of it." He nodded slowly. Could be instinct, but it could also be something pre-installed. "Pre-installed?" Leora frowned. "Did you forget? Sentinel isn't just any dog. He's K9, formerly on special duty. He's probably gone through training phases we'll never read about in any civilian file." Leora remembered the first day she met Sentinel, how he walked into the house without hesitation, as if he had already mapped it, how he could sleep but still twitch his ears at the faintest distant sound, and how, every night, he chose to sit by the window instead of curling up somewhere warm like other dogs. In that moment, she understood. Sentinel wasn't just a companion. He was a living archive of a past no one had ever spoken aloud. I need to know more about where he served," she said softly. Her grandfather turned to her and gave a quiet nod. "Tomorrow, we'll find the man who used to run the old K9 training center in the city. Maybe it's time we stopped treating this like an accident." Leora reached out and gently stroked Sentinel's back. He lifted his head, eyes catching a stray beam of light slipping into the shaded room. It wasn't the look of a dog who'd done something wrong. It was the look of a sentinel who had just awakened a buried past and was ready to walk forward. And in Leora's heart, a thought rose without warning, without logic, like it had always been waiting. If a bus that didn't belong here could appear, then what else is waiting just ahead? Outside, the wind had begun to stir. Golden leaves spun in slow circles across the porch. And Sentinel still hadn't blinked. Ridgeway Hollow had always been a town that kept its silence, not because people didn't care, but because they preferred to speak with their eyes instead of their mouths. But this time was different. The story of the K9 dog that tore a girl's coat at the bus stop spread faster than early autumn maple leaves, and neutrality faded quickly. At the small grocery store near the corner of 6th Street, whispers had begun. "Kessler's granddaughter, that dog attacked her. Word is he's an old police dog, the kind that can snap PTSD, you know. They shouldn't let retired K9s stay in homes with kids." No one said anything to Leora directly, but she could feel it. Every step on the way to school carried another unspoken stare. From behind windows, from between fence slats, from those quiet benches at the park. Everything felt softly distorted, like a thin layer of fog cloaking what people didn't dare ask aloud. Even in class, she could sense hesitation in her friend's eyes. The brown-haired girl at the desk beside hers no longer made conversation. The boy who usually shared his sandwich at recess only gave a quick nod before walking off faster than usual. Leora didn't blame them. She knew what they'd heard was only a fraction of the truth. But what she didn't expect was how the part they hadn't heard made even her start questioning everything. That night, she sat at her desk, a soft glow from the lamp falling across her notebook. Sentinel lay beneath her feet, as always, but instead of sleeping or half-dozing, his eyes were open, focused directly on the front door. It had been 3 nights now. Leora rose quietly and stepped to the window. She pulled the curtain aside and looked out onto the porch. There was nothing there, just cold wind and tree shadows swaying beneath the dim moonlight. But Sentinel was different. Every time a sound stirred, the scrape of a branch, the creak of an old fence, his ears would lift, breath would sharpen, and his gaze would lock outward as if waiting. "Sentinel," she whispered, sitting beside him. "I know what they're saying about you, but I don't believe it. I don't think you lost control. I think you're seeing something we don't." Sentinel didn't react immediately, but a few seconds later, he tilted his head gently, then placed his chin on her knee, soft as an unspoken agreement. Her grandfather entered from the kitchen, carrying 2 mugs of hot cocoa, the scent of chocolate filling the room. "You're not sleeping?" "I saw Sentinel wasn't sleeping. 3 nights now, he's just standing guard like that." He placed 1 mug on the table and looked toward Sentinel. A moment of silence deepened the lines on his face. Not alarm, but contemplation. "Could be old duty habits kicking in, but I won't rule out that he's responding to something we don't understand." "Like a signal?" Leora murmured. He nodded slightly. "Could be a scent, a vibration, a low-frequency sound, things only dogs can sense." The quiet between them grew heavier. The warm lamplight cast a soft shadow over Sentinel's frame. Leora reached out and ran her fingers down his back, feeling every slight contraction in the muscle beneath his fur. "I trust him. But Sentinel is changing, Grandpa. He's not the same dog that used to curl at the foot of my bed. He's stepping back into a role, like he was never truly retired." He didn't answer. Instead, he stood, walked into his study, and returned with an old wooden box. Opening the lid, he pulled out a small silver badge, a K9 insignia engraved with a serial number. This was Sentinel's tag when he was still in service, K9001A. That number's unusually low, which means he was part of the first wave, an experimental unit, even before biometric tech was introduced into training. Experimental for what? I'm not sure of everything, but I once heard about a program designed to create emotional bonds between human and K9 units. They weren't just trained to obey, they were synced with a single human counterpart. Leora felt a chill climb her spine. "You mean, like they could feel each other?" "Not just feel," he said quietly, "but remember what the other felt, even after the human had forgotten." She turned toward Sentinel. He was still watching the door, but this time there was something different in his gaze. Not just alertness. It was the watchfulness of a guardian bound to a purpose, one last mission etched into the fibers of his being. And she realized then, if something was drawing near, Sentinel had known far longer than any of them. And what kept him awake for 3 nights wasn't fear. It was proximity. Outside, the town still slept. But inside the house where memory and instinct had begun to merge, a pair of eyes refused to blink, tracking each shifting shadow beneath the trees. Sentinel had never truly stopped, not for the past, but for the future he was trying, with everything in him, to prevent from repeating itself. Night in Ridgeway Hollow usually came wrapped in a calm that soothed. But tonight, the wind slicing through the maples carried something else, a warning so silent it froze the air in the house like glass across the middle of October. Leora had gone to bed early. Sentinel, though lying by the door as always, had only managed to close his eyes for a few minutes. Her grandfather sat in his study, a warm desk lamp casting his shadow across a faded map laid out before him. He marked every bus stop across town, retraced the route of the strange vehicle from the day before, reviewed witness statements and camera footage. But nothing connected, just fragments without a clear thread. He was about to get up to brew another pot of tea when the landline rang, short, sharp chimes that sliced the quiet. He frowned. Who would call at this hour? The phone rested on the corner of the desk. The screen displayed a string of zeros. No name, no area code, no source. After a moment's hesitation, he picked up and raised it to his ear. Hello? There was no immediate reply, just a faint static hum, like a weak radio frequency. And then a voice, rough, distorted, like it had traveled too far or been deliberately muffled, spoke slowly, almost painfully. If the girl steps onto that bus, she will disappear, just like her parents. Click. The line went dead. No explanation, no chance to respond. Just a single sentence, enough to make him freeze in place, heart skipping its rhythm. Leora's parents. The accident. The paperwork. The reports had all said it was a crash, no clear cause. The vehicle veered off a mountain road. No survivors. But now, someone had said, disappear? As if it hadn't been an accident, but a plan. He set the phone down, turning to check the front door when a piercing howl rang from the living room, shattering the stillness like a blade through heavy air. It wasn't long. It wasn't wild. It was a deep, urgent call from Sentinel, as if he had heard something no human could. He rushed out. Sentinel was standing tall, muscles tight, muzzle raised, ears erect like twin radars locked on the forest beyond. The glass door remained shut. But outside, something had just passed. Not a shape, not a sound, just a gust of wind unnaturally cold sweeping across the porch. Sentinel howled again, shorter this time, sharper. Then he turned and sprinted toward Leora's room, stopping just before her door, staring at the handle like waiting for a command. Her grandfather stepped closer and placed a hand on Sentinel's head. "She's safe," he whispered. "She's being protected, and I won't let it happen again." The next morning, Leora woke with the odd sensation of having emerged from a rainstorm, even though the sky outside was clear and bathed in the golden light of early autumn. She made her way downstairs to find her grandfather already in the kitchen. The coffee had been brewed, but his face looked heavier than usual. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked. "Sort of, but Sentinel was up again, all night." He nodded. "I know, and there's something I need to tell you." She paused, brow slightly furrowed. He set the mug down carefully. "Last night, I got a call. No name, no origin, no trace." "From where?" she asked. "I don't know, but the person only said one thing, that if you'd stepped onto that bus, you would have disappeared. Like your parents." Leora's heart skipped a beat. She dropped onto the chair behind her. "But they said it was an accident." "That's what I used to believe," her grandfather replied quietly. "But now it seems something bigger was behind it all." She looked toward Sentinel. He was lying by the door, but his eyes no longer held the calm of an ordinary morning. They were the eyes of a soldier waiting for his turn to act. "He knew," Leora whispered, "from the very beginning. And now, He still doesn't feel at ease. Her grandfather nodded. We need to find out who made that call, and what they know. I think it's time I reach out to someone from the past. Who? Someone who worked on the special training program, the one where Sentinel was made. Leora reached out and took his hand. She was no longer the confused girl who once shrank beneath whispers and stares. She understood now. Sentinel wasn't malfunctioning. He was doing exactly what he was created to do. Outside, leaves had gathered in quiet spirals on the porch steps. Soft autumn light filtered through the treetops, falling onto the roof like 1,000 memories waiting to be stirred. And in the center of it all, there was a dog who had never truly left his post, as if sleep had never been an option. That morning began with a strange sound. Not the rustle of wind through maple branches or the distant horn of a passing truck, but a knock. Steady, precise, yet unhurried. As if the one at the door wasn't afraid to wait, only arriving when it mattered. Her grandfather set down his coffee and opened the door. The woman standing on the porch didn't resemble anyone from Ridgeway Hollow. She wore a black windbreaker with a small Homeland Security emblem on the sleeve, her hair tied up high, her face sharp, and her eyes scanning everything within a few meters like built-in radar. In her hand was a small gray suitcase, sleek, sealed, and cold in its precision. Good morning. I'm Ray Monroe, agent assigned to the Cyber Anomaly Division, Homeland Security. I'm here in response to a flagged signal involving unauthorized surveillance activity in this town. Her grandfather narrowed his eyes. You're talking about the bus? And more, Monroe replied, stepping inside as her gaze swept across the house, as if her intuition alone could trace the source. She paused when she saw Sentinel lying at Leora's feet. Sentinel's eyes shifted too. Not aggressive, not startled, just the calm caution of two creatures familiar with duty. This the K-9 from Central Police Transfer? Monroe asked. Sentinel, Leora said. He's been with me since we moved here. Looks like he still remembers the mission, Monroe muttered, opening her suitcase to reveal a logo-less laptop with a jet-black interface running software Leora had never seen before. I'd like permission to review the footage from that morning. Her grandfather nodded and pulled up the clip on the desktop computer in the corner. The screen filled with the now familiar image. Leora approaching the bus steps, Sentinel yanking her down, and the unmoving driver behind the black windshield, like a curtain that never lifted. Monroe stepped closer. Pause at second 24. She tapped a command. The frame zoomed in on the driver's face, or at least where a face should have been. No eye response, no facial muscle movement, no thermal variance. This is not a human. She switched to an analysis interface. Lines of unfamiliar data streamed across the screen. External projection layer is operating under a synthetic mapping format, most likely a simulated construct. Leora blinked. A simulated... what? It's when something, or someone, uses a projected image as a mask, creating a false entity, not quite human but programmed to look the part. In this case, highly convincing. But it lacks the one thing we instinctively recognize as alive: random motion. She scrubbed to the end of the footage, where the bus turned the corner and vanished. Now the most important part, Monroe said, removing a specialized drive and connecting it to the auxiliary port on her laptop. I'll run a trace on the vehicle's registry. A moment passed. The screen flashed. No match found, no registry, no GPS history, no DMV record. Monroe typed another string of commands, but the result was the same. That bus has never existed in any official transportation system in any state. The room fell silent. Leora glanced toward Sentinel. He hadn't moved, but it wasn't the stillness of a resting dog. It was the readiness of a gatekeeper, always prepared, no matter what was waiting on the other side of the door. "Then, where did that thing come from?" her grandfather asked, his voice low. Monroe closed the laptop, then turned to face both of them directly. "We're tracking a series of anomalies like this across small towns in the U.S. Children disappearing near transport routes, unmanned buses, simulated interfaces, and all the cameras every time glitch in the exact same few frames." She paused, then lowered her voice. "Ridgeway Hollow is the first place where someone survived to tell the story." Leora felt a shiver crawl down her spine, not from fear, but from clarity. The shapes that once felt vague had begun to take form, and what had saved her wasn't chance. It was Sentinel, the one being who didn't need a machine to sense when something was wrong. Monroe stepped closer to him, kneeling until they were eye to eye. "K9001A, she read from the tag. "Still active, even after decommissioning." Sentinel didn't blink. He stared straight at Monroe, and in that moment, Leora understood. He wasn't reacting, he was evaluating, determining whether this woman was an ally, or just another mask. Monroe rose to her feet. "I need to escalate this to higher command. But to do that, I'll need a full behavioral log of Sentinel, from the moment he reacted until the bus vanished." Her grandfather nodded. "We've kept records, photos, notes, every change in behavior, but you need to tell us. What's really going on?" Monroe's mouth shifted, not into a smile, but something closer to reluctant acknowledgement. "Perhaps..." Sentinel remembered something someone else wanted erased, and that memory, she glanced at Leora, is the only reason she's still here. Outside the window, the sky remained bright and clear, but from the look in the woman's eyes, Leora knew. That light no longer marked a peaceful morning. It had become something else entirely, the fragile line between what we've always known and something that had just awakened. Afternoon passed quietly, as if the small town itself was holding its breath, slowing every heartbeat so as not to disturb the things being unearthed from the past. In the living room of her grandfather's house, Ray Monroe sat in front of her specialized laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting softly on her glasses, where lines of data appeared silently like ink that hadn't dried. Sentinel lay by the window, head resting on his front paws, ears subtly angled toward the wooden desk where Monroe worked. Leora sat beside her grandfather, fingers woven together beneath the table, eyes fixed on the screen. "What's the name of the project?" she asked in a whisper. Monroe didn't look up, fingers still moving. Hollow 92, a classification code for experimental neurobehavioral programs in children, initiated in the late 2000s, funded by a civilian government collaboration, but not tied to the public education system. Her grandfather tightened his grip on Leora's hand. "I never signed anything like that for her." "You didn't need to," Monroe replied calmly. "Most parents were invited under the name of early cognitive potential assessments, or pre-elementary emotional support programs. They were disguised perfectly, sometimes as surveys or even simulation games." She entered the final command. The screen revealed a heavily redacted document. Only a few isolated lines remained. Code name: Hollow 92. Child LH. Duration 9 months. Result: emotional response exceeds baseline. Significant behavioral link with animal-assisted model. Canine type A assigned pairing. ID K9001A. Sentinel. Leora's breath caught. She turned to Sentinel. He was still lying still, but his eyes had widened. Not from fear, not from surprise, but as if he too was remembering. "So that means he was part of the experiment with me?" she murmured. Monroe nodded. "Exactly. Sentinel isn't a standard K9 unit. He was created with a high-compatibility neural structure, capable of syncing with emotional behavior in a specific paired subject. The bond wasn't just trained, it was built through cross-emotional programming. Her grandfather furrowed his brow. What does that mean? It means two beings, one human, one canine, were introduced during their earliest emotional reflex stage. They don't just understand each other. They read signals the average person can't even perceive. And if either of them gets disconnected, the neural link doesn't break. It simply goes dormant. Until something triggers it again, Leora said. Monroe nodded. And that school bus was the trigger point. Leora looked down at her hands, each thread of emotion inside her tightening into a knot only Sentinel seemed able to untangle. All those years they had lived together, she had thought it was a natural closeness. But now she understood. Their connection had come from something older, quieter, and deeper than words could ever explain. Monroe turned the screen towards them. The Hollow 92 project was shut down after a series of uncontainable anomalies, but not because it failed. It was too successful. A few subjects, like Leora and Sentinel, showed results so strong, so stable, the data was flagged as at risk of independent cognitive emergence. And they saw that as a threat? Her grandfather asked. To those who believe in control, yes. The experiment was never meant to create emotion. It was designed to study it, dissect it, and exploit it. Monroe paused, then added softly, and those who couldn't be separated, like you two, were marked as needing isolation. So they tried to separate us? Leora whispered. Not just that, Monroe said, eyes still on the screen. They erased all personal records. No one remembers Sentinel as part of the project. No one recalls Leora ever being enrolled. The entire town was left with no backups, no evidence. Everything was rewritten into one long, ordinary day. For a moment, the room held its breath. No one spoke. Only Sentinel's steady breathing remained, measured and unwavering, like a metronome holding back the chaos of truth. Monroe continued quietly. But Sentinel never forgot. Emotional memory wasn't stored on a server. It lived in his bio-neural matrix, and he kept it intact. Leora turned to him, sat down on the rug, and gently rested her forehead against his. So you remembered me, from the very first moment. Sentinel didn't move, but the slight nudge of his head into her palm was all the answer she needed, wordless but whole. There's a reason I came in person, Monroe said as she closed her laptop. This morning, I received a ping from the transit station near town. The signal matched the same encryption used in the original HOLLOW project. It was a message, coded in the old format. What did it say? Her grandfather asked. Monroe pulled out a printed slip of paper. Subject E92 has been recalled. The loop is not yet complete. The system will reconfigure. Leora whispered. Reconfigure what? Could be memory. Could be space. But whatever it is, it's no longer under human control. Outside, autumn wind still flowed gently through the golden trees. Sentinel stood and stepped onto the porch, sunlight brushing across his back and tracing a soft line of light along his grizzled fur. And Leora, she was no longer the girl from quiet mornings. She was the keeper of a peace that was never meant to be remembered. The next morning, Monroe suggested they visit the Ridgeway Hollow Town Hall to search for old records, birth certificates, medical files, student rosters from previous years. Though her grandfather had kept a few important documents, Monroe believed that what's left in private hands are fragments. The original archives are where intervention leaves its fingerprints. On the way to the municipal building, Leora sat in the back seat, her hand resting on Sentinel's head. He lay quietly by her feet, as if the car itself were a forward outpost. And she, the only life that mattered. Outside the window, the autumn light bathed Ridgeway Hollow in golden calm, draping nostalgia over its quiet streets. But inside Leora, every heartbeat grew heavier, slower, as though she were approaching a room full of unanswered questions. The Civil Archive was located in the basement. Rows of tall filing cabinets coated in dust, yellowed index boards, and an air filled with the scent of old paper and faint traces of machine oil. The clerk on duty was an elderly woman named Maureen, silver-haired and gentle-voiced, who had worked in this archive since before Monroe's father joined the agency. "What are you looking for, dear?" Maureen asked, her rasping voice lined with warmth. "Any records under the name Leora Hastings," Monroe answered for her, providing the birth year and basic family information. Maureen nodded and began by searching the database. Then she moved to 2 physical drawers, pulling out several thin folders and flipping through them one by one. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10. Finally, she exhaled. "You're sure you were born and raised in Ridgeway Hollow?" "I'm sure," Leora nodded. "I've lived here since preschool. My mother passed away in this town's hospital." Maureen glanced at Monroe, then lowered her voice to a near whisper, as if the words themselves were dangerous. "I couldn't find any registration under Leora Hastings before the age of 11. No vaccination records, no preschool health forms, no enrollment in the first-year class." The room seemed to hold its breath. Monroe opened her laptop and accessed a federal-level system. As she dug deeper, her face darkened. "Your mother, Margaret Hastings, she's listed on a death certificate. But there's no hospital admission, no patient file, no medical images, no doctor's signature. It's as if she was never in that hospital room," Leora finished quietly. Her grandfather stood frozen, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "But I was there. I held her hand when she passed. The whole town knew." "People remember," Monroe said softly, "but the official records have been rewritten. Maybe deleted, maybe blurred, but definitely no longer intact." By then, Sentinel had stepped toward the cabinet. His nose moved gently along the paper edges, sniffing, searching for something strange yet familiar, as if he were tracing the scent of a memory that had just been taken. They left the building in silence. On the stone steps, Leora paused and looked toward the park playground across the street. There, an old swing still creaked in the wind, the same swing where she used to sit with her mother for hours after school. She remembered every story her mother told, every lullaby whispered into the breeze, even the knitted scarf used to wipe her tears after her first scraped knee. And now, every last fragment of that had been reduced to a memory locked in her mind. No physical record, no written proof that it ever happened. "You know," Monroe said gently, "there's a type of system called blank suppression. It doesn't erase memories completely. It just blurs the verification points. It doesn't wipe everything clean. It simply makes it too vague to resist." "But I still remember everything," Leora said. "That's what makes you dangerous to those who created the system," Monroe replied, her voice as still as a frozen lake. Her grandfather looked up. "You mean, the people behind Project HOLLOW92 are still active?" "Not active," Monroe said. "They're restarting, reintroducing memory loops, pulling former subjects back into the system." "Like the school bus," Leora murmured. "It was a simulation designed to draw me in." Monroe nodded. "And if Sentinel hadn't been there?" "You would have stepped into something that doesn't lead anywhere real," she said. "Just a branching path, designed to overwrite your entire truth with a fabricated storyline." Wind brushed through Leora's hair. She looked over at Sentinel. He wasn't looking back, but stood close enough that she could feel his warmth, steady and grounded, the only thing left untouched in a world that was slowly losing its shape. That night, Leora sat down with her notebook, not her laptop, not a voice recorder, but a thick-bound journal and a violet ink pen. She wrote about the scent of her mother's perfume, about her 7th birthday, about the first name her mother gave Sentinel, Button, before the police renamed him. She wrote it all down as if each word were the last surviving evidence of her own existence. And Sentinel, in his timeless ritual, rested his head on her legs as she wrote, his eyes half shut, ears twitching gently with every page turned. Memory was the only thing they hadn't taken, and as long as Sentinel was here, they never would. Even past 10 that night, Leora couldn't sleep. The pages she had just written sat neatly on her desk, but her thoughts kept spinning, puzzle pieces in her mind still searching for where they fit. She turned restlessly in bed, her gaze often drifting toward the corner of the room, where Sentinel lay still, head resting on his front paws, eyes closed but ears angled slightly, like a guard listening for something nameless. Click. A soft sound, barely louder than a claw tapping against wood. Sentinel had risen. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply looked at her once, then turned silently and walked out of the room. Leora sat upright, said nothing, and followed. His steps led her to her grandfather's study, the room filled with old blueprints, yellowed architecture books, and engineering journals from his teaching days. But this time, Sentinel didn't stop near the shelves or drafting table. Instead, he circled to the back of a tall wooden cabinet and pressed his nose gently against the lowest panel. Thump. The panel shifted slightly, revealing a narrow compartment, a hidden drawer blocked by a metal brace and an old-style latch. Leora knelt down, hands trembling just slightly as she opened it. Inside was a worn leather file pouch, faded with age but still intact. On the cover, nearly vanished with time, were the words, Project K, 9001A, non-separable with IA 92. She held her breath. Carefully, she drew the file out. It felt like touching something sacred, something both unreal and undeniable, a portion of her life that had been buried and now returned on its own. She opened it. The first page was a photo of Sentinel, not the gray-flecked figure lying beside her now, but a younger version, his black and tan coat deep and glossy, eyes sharp and hyper-alert. Beneath the image was a chip ID, K9001A, with a status designation. Paired successfully. Subject E92, separation not permitted under any circumstance. Leora skimmed the clinical notes. Emotional synchronization exceeds standard thresholds. Protective reflexes beyond typical K9 response. Displays full neural stability only in presence of E92. Memory architecture analysis confirms visual emotive data retention. Recommendation: do not reprogram. Do not retrain. Maintain only within E92 proximity. Each line cut and healed at once, validating the strange moments she had never been able to explain. Sentinel's watchful stare in the early days, the sleepless nights he stood guard without a sound. On the final page, a handwritten note. Penmanship technical, yet slightly trembling. Sentinel shows acute distress when separated from E92, even for brief periods. Refuses food. No sleep, no response. Upon reunification, single glance from E92 restabilizes all parameters. No one trained him to do this. He chose to remember, and he chose not to leave. Leora folded the file slowly. Her hand rested on Sentinel's neck. He was sitting beside her, eyes quietly locked on hers, as if waiting for confirmation. "You brought me here so I could know, didn't you?" she asked softly. Sentinel didn't respond. but the gentle press of his head into her palm, warm and certain, said more than words ever could. The next morning her grandfather found them still in the study, Sentinel lying with his head atop the old folder, and Leora fast asleep on the carpet, her hand resting on his back. He didn't wake them. He only draped a thin blanket gently over her shoulders. But his eyes lingered long on the file, the words non-separable still legible, a reminder he once overlooked, never fully understood. Perhaps he had once believed Sentinel was just a comforting gift after a loss. But now he knew. Sentinel was the last piece of truth. The one witness who had never forgotten who Leora really was. That afternoon, Monroe returned with a specialized RFID scanner. She waved it slowly over the back of Sentinel's neck. The screen flashed, a perfect match with the archived file. "There's no mistake," she said. "Even with the system wiped, he retained the original imprint. This isn't a regular tracker chip. It's an emotional response archive. Meaning, when Leora experiences a strong feeling, he stores it, like a library of sensations." Leora turned to Sentinel. "So, my memories are inside you too?" Monroe nodded. "And that's the part they could never reach, because real memory, it doesn't live in files or records. It lives in the only one who never chose to forget." Sentinel rested his head on Leora's lap. Outside, the sunlight tilted gently through the pale yellow curtains, drawing a warm glow around the two figures, one human, one canine, as if the world had faltered in many places, but this corner still held what was right. The early breeze filtered through the last maple leaves, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen foliage across Ridgeway Forest. The sun had not fully risen, but inside Mr. Hastings' living room, the pale green glow from Monroe's laptop screen brushed her face with a cold hue. Leora sat nearby, her eyes locked onto the pulsing waves on the screen, anomalies blinking with each passing second. Sentinel lay beneath the desk, head resting on Leora's leg, ears upright, as if even in rest, he was listening to something beyond human hearing. Monroe tapped gently on the keyboard, her voice low and steady. "Did you know, in certain emotion-based memory capture programs, they don't just record data. They broadcast a kind of recall signal?" Leora nodded faintly, though she'd never heard the term before. But the way Monroe said it made her understand. It wasn't just a signal. It was something powerful enough to pull a person back to the place where they were once overwritten, once programmed to forget who they truly were. "This signal," Monroe continued, "appeared about 8 hours ago. It's not on any civilian frequency, not satellite-based. It came from underground, 3 miles west of Ridgeway's forest edge." "You mean something down there is still active?" Leora's grandfather asked quietly. "Not just active," Monroe replied slowly, "but reactivating." She enlarged the 3D terrain map. Beneath layers of earth, a faint pulse, like a digital heartbeat, emitted steady waves, each cycle exactly 30 seconds apart. Leora clenched her fists. "It's calling me back." Monroe turned to her. "Or calling something inside you back." They left the house just as the sun rose above the eastern hills. Sentinel led the way, nose to the breeze, sniffing the thin air like he was analyzing memories buried deep in the soil. Leora followed, carrying a small backpack with a notebook and a voice recorder. Monroe brought along her signal locator and an ultrasonic amplifier. The Ridgeway Trail wasn't unfamiliar, but it had never felt this distant. The deeper they went, the more altered everything seemed. Trees growing at odd angles, vines wrapping the canopy as if trying to conceal something, and the air thickened as if waiting for time itself to be remembered. As they neared the signal source, Monroe's wave meter began to beep rapidly. On her screen, a repeating frequency emerged. 19.92 kilohertz, the same ultrasonic range used in the Hollow 92 program. This station was wiped from the maps in 2013, Monroe said, but the equipment still works, likely powered by a geothermal loop. Leora looked up and saw it. Hidden behind fallen branches in the middle of the forest stood a rusted metal hatch, old but still operable. Sentinel stepped forward, placing a paw on it, then turned back to look at Leora. No bark, no whimper, just that look. Quiet agreement. They opened the hatch with a rusted iron bar. A rush of cold air escaped, carrying the scent of old circuits and damp steel. A spiral staircase led down, not deep, only about 10 meters, but as they descended, all sound seemed to vanish. No birds, no wind, only breathing, 3 humans, and 1 dog. Beneath the surface, a round chamber appeared, its walls lined with soundproof metal. At the center stood a translucent glass cube, glowing in rhythm with the pulsing waves. Etched into its surface, a 92, access only through direct emotional resonance. Monroe stepped forward, scanning the device. It doesn't open with prints or codes, it opens through recollection. Leora stepped closer. Sentinel followed, pressing in beside her. She gently placed her hand on the glass. A faint glow spiraled beneath her palm, drawing from the emotions within. And then, before them, images began to form. Leora at 4 clinging to the neck of a puppy, that very same young Sentinel, a pastel playroom where she drew on glass walls with wax crayons while Sentinel sat quietly nearby. A moment of tears after a vaccination. Sentinel resting his chin on her knee to comfort her. "These were the purest moments," Monroe whispered, "not where you were observed, but where your emotions became the trigger itself." The pulses ceased, the cube went still, and then it opened. Inside was a data shard, laser-etched onto a transparent glass plate labeled K9001A/E92 Sync Final. "This is the final record," Monroe said. "It no longer exists in any server, but it survives in the bond between 2 living beings." Leora gripped the glass plate tightly, then turned to Sentinel. "You're not just the one who remembers for me. You're the only proof I ever lived, ever existed, and was never overwritten." Sentinel gently rested his head in her palm. No sound. But in that moment, deep underground where everything had once been buried, memory was summoned, not by waves or commands, but by a loyalty no language could explain. That night, Leora fell asleep earlier than usual. She placed the glass plate containing the Hollow 92 archive on her bookshelf, beside a small lamp with a soft amber glow, and lay back on the bed as the forest wind began threading through the last red maple leaves of the season. Sentinel lay beneath the window, moonlight brushing across the faded fur along his spine. The stillness was so complete, she could hear the breeze slide across the rooftop. And then, the dream began. Leora found herself in a kindergarten classroom. Tiny chairs, a chalkboard layered with dust, hand-drawn pictures taped to the walls. Everything appeared correct, and yet completely wrong. She sat down in one of the low chairs, fit for a 5-year-old. Around her, the classmates began to appear. They wore matching blue and white uniforms, had braided hair, and clutched crayons in their hands. But every single one had the same face, not like twins, more like copies, imperfect and vacant. Eyes with no depth, smiles frozen in place for the entire dream. The little Leora inside the dream smiled. But the Leora watching from within, the one who was dreaming, felt a chill crawl down her spine. Then came a voice. "Leora, your mother's here." She turned around. A woman stepped into the room. Slender frame, long hair, White dress, graceful gait, and a smile so gentle it seemed programmed. "Mom?" Leora whispered. The woman knelt and wrapped her arms around her. Warm. So warm. A faint jasmine scent drifted from her dress, the same scent embedded in an old handkerchief Leora once kept as a child, the one Grandpa said belonged to your mother. But no name came to her. Not a single name reached her lips, not in the dream, not even in her mind. "Let's go home, sweetheart." Leora nodded and let herself be led. But just as she crossed the classroom doorway, she turned to look back and saw the children still seated, still smiling, still wearing the same face, as if no one had ever left. She woke in the middle of the night. The room was still dark, lit only by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Yet her heart was racing, as if she had just witnessed something indescribable. Sentinel had already risen, eyes wide, head tilted, as if waiting. I dreamed of my mother," she whispered. "But I didn't know her name." Sentinel walked over and nudged her hand. Leora shivered. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of truth that washed over her. She had been led through that classroom door, had held that soft hand. But the pieces felt borrowed, stitched from memories that didn't belong to her. The next morning, Monroe returned. She had just received a preliminary decryption from the archive recovered underground. On the living room table, fragments of notes lit up, like an incomplete map of someone's memory. A 92 responds positively to simulated environments. Emotional memory retention is high, but slowly diverging from base identity. Recommendation: imprint maternal archetype to maintain emotional tether. What you think of as your earliest memories, Monroe spoke slowly, may not have come from real life, but from scripted scenarios designed to stabilize emotional responses. Leora said nothing, not because she didn't believe it, but because part of her had always suspected it. "What about the dreams?" she asked. "The feelings like I've lived through them?" Monroe shook her head softly, but her gaze grew heavier. "The feelings are real. Emotional memories are still memories, even if they didn't come from the real world." Grandpa spoke after a long silence. "I always thought I raised her with enough love to fill any blank spot in her past, but if that past was deliberately constructed, then now she deserves to know what part of it was real." Sentinel had returned to the window. He sat facing the Ridgeway woods, as always. "He knows," Monroe said. "Even after the wipeout, even with the servers gone, Sentinel still carries the original imprint of every connection. And because of that, he's the living anchor between true memory and manufactured memory." Leora looked at Monroe. "I don't remember everything, but Sentinel doesn't forget." Monroe nodded. And maybe that's why, for the first time, a child from the project was saved, not by the system, but by someone unprogrammed who simply chose to be loyal. Outside, the leaves had begun to fall more quickly. Sentinel rose and walked over to the girl. Leora knelt and wrapped her arms around him, not to reclaim something lost, but to believe that from this moment forward, whatever truly belonged to her would never be hidden again. The morning light filtered quietly through the dense canopy of Ridgeway Hollow, casting soft golden slants onto the moss-covered ground. The trio, Monroe, Leora, and Sentinel, continued toward what Monroe referred to as the core layer of the auxiliary data system, a place deep within the forest, buried under time and silence. Sentinel led the way with a stride so fluid it was as if the blades of grass had memorized his steps. Every movement he made brought Leora a sense of calm, something not explained by logic, just something that existed and was enough. Then suddenly, as they reached a sunken grove where ancient trees arched into a natural vault above them, Sentinel came to a stop. He raised his head, ears twitching, and let out a long howl. It wasn't a cry of warning. It wasn't panic. It was a call, layered with emotion, resonant like a hand pressing gently on memory. And then, something happened that froze both Leora and Monroe in place. From the surrounding trees, massive maple trunks, weathered oak giants, came a series of whispers. Not human. Not natural. They sounded like fragments of old recordings playing through hidden speakers embedded deep inside the wood. And the voices were Leora's, from when she was just a child. "My name is Leora. I'm 4.5. I miss my mom so much. Mommy, I drew a dog today. I'm scared of the rain. Please don't leave." Leora took a step back. Her lips parted, but no words came. The entire forest seemed to be returning her memories, not as images, not as vivid emotions, but through her own voice. Sentences she didn't even recall saying, yet recognized the moment she heard them. Monroe pulled out a wave detector. The signal was spiking erratically. "This isn't random echo. It's subject frequency response, deliberate emotional reverberation. Someone, or something, has programmed the vegetation here to store memory, like an external recall system." "It's like the forest was once my memory room," Leora murmured, her voice catching. They pressed onward. As they approached the forest's core, the voices became clearer. At a section so thick with canopy that no sunlight could pass through, Sentinel veered sharply off the path. No one questioned it. Monroe glanced at her scanner, then nodded. "You should follow him," she said softly. "This might be beyond anything science can decode." Leora followed. Sentinel brought her to a massive, fallen tree, hollowed by decay. Inside, not machinery, not a den, was a small bronze tin box, gently cloaked in a layer of moss. She knelt down, hands trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside were a cream-colored handkerchief, embroidered with the words, "Leora, love you always." A pencil sketch of a little girl holding the paw of a large dog. And a perforated plastic tag, like a lab access badge, stamped with the code E92, hand-recorded emotional anchor. "This isn't digitized data," Monroe whispered as she examined the items. "These are physical memories, tangible fragments, evidence that you once lived, once loved, not as part of a simulation, but as something real." Leora clutched the handkerchief, pressing it softly against her cheek. A faint trace of jasmine still lingered. Sentinel lay down beside the old tree. Not alert, not waiting, just resting, as though returning to a place long known. And then, from the branches above, one final voice drifted down. "I couldn't keep you forever, but someone always would." Leora didn't look up. She didn't need to, because Sentinel had risen, touching his nose gently to her hand, as if to confirm that the voice, the memory, wherever it came from, was true. By the time they turned back, sunlight had poured gold across the path. The Ridgeway Forest, once known as the quietest place in the Northeast, had spoken today. Not in human language, but in the echo of attachment. Monroe said quietly, "I've worked on memory projects all my life, but this is the first time I believe something exists beyond what can be programmed." Leora didn't reply. She just kept walking, hand wrapped around the embroidered handkerchief, with Sentinel by her side like a living shadow. And behind them, the forest held on to what no one could explain, but no longer seemed haunting. It felt warm. The path into the Ridgeway Mountain opened like a man-made fracture through ancient stone. Monroe's flashlight swept across damp walls, lighting up strands of rusted wiring. Each step echoed, not with sound, but with the feeling of entering a part of memory that had been locked away for far too long. Sentinel didn't need direction. He led with certainty, his pace sure, as if his very body remembered every turn and corridor. Leora followed in silence, her hand tightening around the strap of her backpack, where the embroidered cloth lay tucked safely. Monroe stopped before an old metal door. The control panel beside it blinked with a faint red light. "We're here," she said. "Below this are the individual memory simulation units. Each room, one phase." As the door opened with a soft hiss, cold air slipped out like a sigh. The space beyond was dim, but as their footsteps crossed the threshold, the walls responded, gradually coming to life with a low ambient glow. The first room appeared, a child's bedroom painted in soft pink, with a tiny window curtained in floral fabric. Leora froze. "This was my room when I was 5, she whispered. "It's exactly the same." From the bear-shaped rug to the frayed-eared plush bunny, everything was in place. But Sentinel didn't step inside. He remained at the doorway, staring at one corner of the room. His eyes narrowed. Then came a low growl, not threatening, but more like a warning drawn from instinct. Leora followed his gaze. A photograph on the shelf. It showed her, smiling beside her mother, who wore a gentle expression. But this time something was off. The eyes. Her mother's eyes were too symmetrical. No visible capillaries, no trace of moisture, no emotional depth. They looked like eyes generated by an algorithm, reconstructed in 3D. "This isn't my mom," Leora said quietly. "I don't remember her face clearly, but I know." Her eyes weren't empty like that. Monroe nodded. The system can only rebuild what it has. Without deep emotional data, it fills the gaps with templates. Most of them are fabricated. They moved on. The next room, a long corridor, like one from a hospital. Frosted windows, rain outside. 2 adults stood talking at the far end. "I don't want to split," a child's voice echoed from somewhere. "I don't want to choose between Dad and Mom." Leora stood still. She recognized the voice. It was hers. And the 2 adults still had blurred, indistinct faces. Sentinel growled again, then turned, gently nudging her hand with his nose, as if urging her to walk away. "I used to think I couldn't remember those days because I was too little," she whispered. "But now I know. Someone didn't want me to remember." The next room was her 7th birthday. A cake, balloons, and many friends gathered around. Everyone clapped, laughed, and sang birthday songs. But their faces were identical, and exactly like the children she'd seen in her dreams. The same face copied over and over, only the clothes and hairstyles changed. Leora shivered. "This wasn't a real party," she said. "I remember that birthday. It was just Grandpa. And Sentinel. He'd only been with us for a week." Monroe confirmed. Emotion-based simulations often require resonance models to enhance believability. Lacking real input, the system constructs scenes and inserts imaginary friends. Sentinel quietly walked to her side, then sat down, eyes locked on the projected figures, like a warrior standing guard over memories. Finally, they reached the deepest room. It wasn't a simulation. It was a sensory storage chamber, where real memories had been compressed into data. On an aged interface that still held a faint glow, a line blinked on screen. Primary emotional anchor, E92, Leora/K9001A, Sentinel. Status, active. "This is the final point," Monroe whispered. "Here, the entire emotional link between the 2 subjects is stored, just in case the system ever loses all top-level data. And here, the one thing it can't fake, is the bond." Leora stepped forward, placing her palm against the surface sensor. Immediately, scattered sound clips began to play. Indistinct words, but threaded with a familiar rhythm. And then suddenly, her voice came through. "Sentinel, are you asleep?" Followed by a soft, steady breathing sound, right beside her. It wasn't a simulated memory. It was a real night. A quiet, ordinary night that someone had secretly preserved, because it held something real. Leora bent down, brushing her hand gently through Sentinel's fur. "We really lived," she whispered, "even if just for a few days. It was real." Sentinel rested his head on her leg and exhaled. Out in the hallway, the soft yellow lights remained on. And beneath the mountain, in a room once filled with artificial echoes, a piece of true life had finally been restored. The monitor in the command booth powered on slowly, as if it, too, hesitated to reveal what was about to surface. Lines of code streamed across the screen like a digital river, symbols no one in the room could understand, except Monroe, who continued to input the decryption sequence with the meticulous care of someone unlocking a door that must not open the wrong way. A primary frame emerged at the center of the interface. Leora held her breath. There she was, another version of herself. The footage began with a quiet morning. A street, a breeze, maple leaves curling and spinning across the pavement. The Leora in the recording wore a red backpack, stepping briskly out the front door, her right hand brushing gently over Sentinel's head, exactly like every normal morning she remembered. But something wasn't right. That girl, her smile was too symmetrical, her footsteps too precise. Every movement flowed with a kind of unnerving smoothness. Then came the shot of her boarding a yellow school bus. The driver was blurred. No facial features, no blinking, no motion other than sitting upright. And in that moment, the screen jolted. The Leora on screen began to distort. From an ordinary teenage girl, her face warped, contorted as if being twisted by invisible force. Her eyes stretched unnaturally, her smiling mouth remained frozen like a mask. The cheeks twitched out of sync. The footage looped. Then again, and again. Each time, more distorted. As if the system was forcing a face into a template it couldn't truly match. Leora stepped back half a pace. "That's not me," she said, voice low, almost a whisper. Monroe nodded. "It's not. But the terrifying part is, the system wasn't designed to capture you. It was designed to convince you that this was you." "Over and over," she continued, "until you began to believe those memories were yours." Sentinel let out a low growl, not aggressive, but a deep response to something he sensed was false. The dim light of the screen flickered on, cycling through more segments. Leora, sitting in a classroom surrounded by classmates who all had identical faces. Leora, standing in a hospital hallway, eyes vacant, staring through frosted glass. Leora, stepping into a house that wasn't hers, yet smiling as though she'd grown up there. Each version looked like her, but none were her. "I used to feel empty," Leora said. "Like I was alive, but not really real. Now I understand why. They didn't want me to remember. They wanted me to accept what was fabricated." Monroe tapped gently on the console. "One part of Project Hollow 92, she said, her tone low, was to test the ability to rewrite memory for emotional adaptability. But in some cases, the original emotional data was too strong. It resisted, and when it couldn't be fused, the system chose repetition instead." "Then why haven't I been merged in?" Leora asked. Monroe looked toward Sentinel. "Because you were never walking alone." At that, Sentinel lifted his head. He touched his nose to Leora's hand, then sat beside her, as if anchoring her in place, holding her steady in the storm of warped memories. "You can reject the system," Monroe said. Not by fighting it, but by affirming what's real. Leora turned to the screen. A final image was playing in slow motion. Her, stepping onto the bus, smiling uneasily, then turning to glance back at Sentinel and disappearing. No fade-out, no transition. Just vanishing, like a file erased. "I never boarded that bus," she whispered, "because I was saved." The control room fell silent. But inside Leora, something began to sharpen. She had once believed memory was what we recall, but now she understood. Memory is what we choose not to forget. And the one thing untouched in all the simulations was Sentinel. He was always there. Whether at the edge of the frame or hidden in shadow, his eyes never changed. Leora looked at him. "We're going all the way, aren't we?" Sentinel answered with a firm touch of his nose to her hand, warm, unwavering. Then turned his head, eyes fixed on the corridor beyond the screen, the one that led to the core memory storage. Truths still hidden lay ahead. But this time, Leora didn't walk in alone. She stepped forward with a real memory, and the friend who would never let that memory be overwritten. Sentinel. The archive room sat at the deepest level of the underground facility, where the flickering lights pulsed like exhausted eyes that hadn't closed in years. Monroe placed a metal case on the table, entered 3 layers of access codes. A faint metallic click sounded, clean and cold. Inside, no weapons, no drives, only old file folders, their paper yellowed with time. On the cover of the thickest one, a red stamped label read, Project Hollow 92, Deployment Phase. No identification records stored. Leora opened it carefully, page by page, typed reports, surveillance captures, signal mapping diagrams. But what made her pause was a single sheet clipped to the top left corner, a faded photograph, her mother and father. Younger, but the eyes were unmistakable. Beneath the image, a handwritten note in blue ink read, 2 technical-level subjects, formerly involved in the primary core system structure, detected divergence in memory routing algorithms, disappeared after proposing to restore original selfhood to subject E92. Additional note, both named their child outside the system. Leora looked up, her gaze meeting Monroe's. "My name wasn't assigned by the system?" Monroe nodded slightly. In the early childhood memory simulation models, children were typically given identification codes. No real names, because names root identity. They create emotional anchors, and the system was designed to erase those. She pointed to the final line of the note. "But your parents, they called you Leora before the system could encode a tag." Leora went quiet. Her heartbeat pressed hard against her chest, not because she had just discovered something new, but because deep down she had always known. That name, though never spoken, never recorded on any document, had remained real enough to survive every overwrite. Another sheet sat beneath the file, a schematic of the memory overlay network, a deep simulation system designed to replay images until the subject forgot they had ever been anything else. It worked as an emotional loop, a familiar image. A name called out by the system, a feeling that seemed self-remembered. Then, loop. Loop again. Loop until the subject no longer questioned that the memory had been programmed. And every time someone stepped onto the bus, they were accepting the replica. They were surrendering the right to remember. "Your parents understood that," Monroe said softly. "They tried to break the loop, but dismantling the entire system would erase everyone." "So they didn't disappear," Leora whispered. "They hid, so a way out could remain." Monroe placed a hand on her shoulder. "You are that way out, and Sentinel is the final lock." She looked toward Sentinel, resting silently beside the table, amber eyes glinting under the soft overhead light. No one had trained Sentinel for this. No one had ordered it. There was no coded emotion or triggered response. Sentinel had chosen to stay, chosen to guard, chosen to pull her back from stepping onto that bus she thought was ordinary. And now, it was all beginning to make sense. If she had boarded that day, she would no longer be Leora. Only E92, a collection of voices, glances, and smiles crafted by the system. "I have no doubts anymore," Leora said. "About what?" Monroe asked. "About who I am, and why Sentinel was deployed at that exact moment." Monroe turned to the final page, a single typed line. "Sentinel, IDK 9001, a special note. Emotional bond exceeds measurable thresholds. Only stable in proximity to subject E92. Do not separate under any circumstance." Leora smiled gently. Her first true smile since stepping foot in this place, not because of the secrets unveiled, but because, at last, the pieces aligned, like a door unlocked by the very key named Sentinel. Outside, the first snowfall dusted the peaks of Ridgeway Hollow. No fanfare, no warning, just quiet change, like the way a girl, carrying a name no one assigned, yet never erased, was now preparing to face the deepest core of memory. And this time, she would not be overwritten. She would write back, with her own eyes, with her real name, and with the only companion who had never once forgotten who she truly was. The core appeared before them like an artificial heart, not beating, not breathing, but pulsing with a cold shimmer, as if it knew how to watch those who dared look into it. The central chamber was round, lined with dim steel walls dusted in silver. Beneath them, tangled cables snaked directly into the data core. The cube glowed blue, spinning slowly, its surface reflecting like unsettled water. With each rotation, an old image flickered. A laughing child, a classroom door opening, a yellow school bus with no plates. Leora stood before it, breath suspended. Sentinel did not bark, did not growl, did not block her path. Instead, he gently placed his paw on her foot, light, steady. Not to stop her, but to be there, to remind her she wasn't facing this alone. Leora slowly opened the small fabric wallet she always kept in her coat. Inside, an old photograph, its edges worn, its color faded to brown. It was the day Sentinel first arrived at her home. He still wore his old K9 harness, back hunched from the long road. The little girl in the photo, smaller, hair not yet grown, eyes barely open, was reaching out to touch Sentinel's head. No bright smile, no glowing light. But there was truth, a moment that could never be programmed. Leora stepped forward. The core reflected her face, but inside it, a different version surfaced, a stiff replica, waving at someone invisible from inside the bus. "That's not me," she whispered. The core pulsed, subtle but reactive. Monroe stood silently behind her, not interfering, not rushing. Previous tests had shown the system only truly responded when the original emotional self made the choice. "You can't choose through logic," Monroe had once told her. "There's only one way to mislead the system. You have to input something it cannot replicate." Leora lifted the photo until it aligned with the core's glowing surface, then gently placed it against the light-emitting panel. "I didn't choose a memory," she said, her voice steady, not trembling, just calmly reaffirming something that came from deep within. "I chose the one who lived it with me." In that moment, the core's light jolted violently, as if it had been yanked from stability. The slowly rotating images inside began to accelerate, mixing into a blur before shattering like broken glass. Her face in the replica warped, stretching, smearing like ink. A cascade of fabricated memories surfaced all at once. A kindergarten classroom, a farewell to parents, a graduation ceremony that never happened. But none of it could overwrite the moment Sentinel placed a paw on her foot. None of it could erase the real photo, folded and worn by time. None of it could distort the way a dog lived beside her, night after night. No program could replicate the way Sentinel looked at her every morning. The core let out a piercing screech. Cables along the floor recoiled as if recoiling in fear. A loud crash echoed from the ceiling. The room's structure began to fracture. Monroe lunged forward. "Chain reaction! We need to evacuate! Now!" But Sentinel didn't move. Leora saw it clearly, how he stood between her and the convulsing core, ears alert, stance firm, still carrying the presence of a K9 on duty. No, Sentinel wasn't a K9 anymore. He was the final keeper of a true memory. A thunderous crack tore through the room. The right wall split open, flinging shards of steel as a burst of electric blue exploded across the chamber. Sentinel held his ground. Leora rushed in, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in the silvering fur that had witnessed the years. She didn't know whether the system would collapse, or if any data would remain. But she knew one thing. As long as someone truly remembers, no system can replace it. Monroe pulled them both out just as the ceiling gave way behind them. A final screech echoed through the corridor like the dying breath of an obsolete machine. The blue light faded, leaving only silence, like a blank page untouched by ink. Behind them, the memory override chamber was now just an empty room. No photos, no wires, no sound, no program. No one remained, except the first real choice that had just been remembered. In Leora's palm, the photo was still intact. Except now, the old crease had unfolded, and faintly pressed into the surface was the mark of Sentinel's paw, where he had once touched it. No one taught him to do that. No system instructed him. It was the act of a free being, one who remembered what was worth keeping. And that had saved her. The wind in Ridgeway Forest began to shift. Cold air slipped through rocky passages, as if nature itself was preparing to mourn something about to vanish. The data vault, now exposed like a scar being peeled open, groaned in silence, its steel plates trembling just before the self-destruct sequence activated from within the core. No sirens, no fiery blast. Just a deep, low tremor, thin as the sigh of a dying world. Leora ran, her steps pounding over loose stone, the ground beneath her no longer solid like before. Monroe kept close, monitoring flickering readouts on a portable tracker. A jagged line of blue flickered across the hallway, then died out, as if the system was bleeding out power or memory. Sentinel stayed beside her. Though his left shoulder was slick with blood, real blood, dark and metallic scented, his steps remained steady, carrying the discipline of a K9 who had never left anyone behind. "We're close to the exit," Monroe called out, her voice low but unshaken. Leora turned back and saw the pipes behind them start to retract, like arteries shutting down. But just then, a sheet of steel dropped from above. A heavy piece of framework came slicing down at an angle, cutting the air like a blade thrown from the shadows. Leora froze. Sentinel sprang forward. No growl, no waiting for orders. He tilted his body, shielding her with his entire frame like a living wall. The steel struck deep into his hindquarters with a metallic thud that sounded like iron driving into flesh. A low, guttural cry escaped. But Sentinel did not fall back. Leora screamed, "Sentinel!" Monroe pulled her forward. "We have to keep moving!" They dashed through the final stretch of tunnel, once lined with guidance lights, now lit only by the dim beam of a headlamp slicing through dust-filled air. Sentinel limped behind them, refusing assistance. Leora glanced down. His legs trembled, but his eyes still scanned each dark corner. Not out of suspicion, but because he was making sure this last time nothing would harm her. As they reached the exit, the ground beneath their feet began to give way, as if something inside had removed the final brace. No explosion, no smoke, no fire. Just a sudden collapse behind them, a soft sink like paper folding in on itself. Then nothing. Dry leaves drifted into the empty space, like the vault had never existed, like the concept of overwritten memory had never been real. Leora knelt beside Sentinel. The wound had soaked through half his lower body, his tan and gold coat now stained deep red. Yet Sentinel still managed to lift his head, nudging her wrist gently, right where the leather cord held the photo that had helped them break the loop. "You did good," she whispered, not crying, only speaking with the quiet gratitude of someone who had seen too much to need words. Monroe stepped forward and signaled to the distant rescue team. "There was no detonation. We've confirmed. It was an erasure, not destruction." Leora turned toward the void beyond, the place that used to be a maze of synthetic memory. Now it was just a patch of still forest, as if the land itself had refused to retain any trace of what had been forced upon it. "Do you think everything that was wrong, if not remembered by anyone, Zuaz, will just disappear on its own?" she asked. Monroe didn't answer immediately. She crouched, resting her hand on Sentinel's head, in a silent gesture shared only by those who had spent too long working in shadows. "Maybe. It only takes one person to remember it right." A while later, the ambulance pulled up along the edge of the woods. Leora sat beside Sentinel in the back, her hand still pressing gently on the part of her coat stained with blood, right where the shard had pierced. But Sentinel didn't drift off. He was bandaged, breathing steady, and kept his head resting in her lap, his tail giving a faint wag, like a final whisper. We made it back. They passed through the federal checkpoint. Monroe filed the encrypted report, logging only one sentence. "Target erased, but vital value preserved, in a being who chose what was real." That afternoon, the sun angled low through the trees of Ridgeway, casting soft light that wasn't blinding, wasn't dramatic, just enough to highlight the footprints of three figures: a woman in a dark windbreaker, a girl with tangled hair, and a dog with a limp, ears still alert. No one spoke, but all of them knew. What belongs to a human heart, when held by loyalty, can never be replaced. And if there ever was an explosion in this life, the greatest thing that might fall is whatever no one wants to keep anymore. The clock on the wall of the veterinary clinic's waiting room ticked slowly, each second echoing like a steady heartbeat. Leora sat by the window, the late afternoon light spilling in across the room, just enough to illuminate a corner of the stainless steel bed where Sentinel lay. The white bandages around his waist had already been changed twice. The bleeding had stopped. But the thing that brought her the most comfort wasn't the numbers on the heart monitor. It was that look. Sentinel didn't whimper, didn't howl, didn't struggle. He simply stared at her with those dark brown eyes, as if to say everything was all right. And if anything needed to be said, it was already spoken in that gaze. "You've got another 15 minutes, the young nurse said softly, adjusting the medication schedule on the wall chart. "But his vitals are good. No sign of fever. Heart rate steady. You can breathe a little easier now." Leora nodded, thanked her, then moved closer to the low stretcher. She sat in the chair, letting her arm rest beside Sentinel's neck, the spot he always liked her to scratch before falling asleep. "You don't have to remember everything," she whispered. Sentinel closed his eyes, halfway, tail giving a tiny flick without making a sound. But to Leora, that was a yes. News of the Ridgeway Forest incident never made it to any mainstream outlet. No urgent broadcasts, no in-depth reports. The system had been erased, the facility dismantled, and everything quietly filed away as a data malfunction at a legacy storage station. But Ridgeway Hollow didn't need the media to remember a story. People in town passed it on, fragment by fragment, disjointed but somehow unanimous. Sentinel had pulled the girl from an unmarked bus. Someone saw them enter the woods. The vehicle never came back. And then Sentinel was carried out alone, blood across his back, but eyes never leaving the girl with the tangled hair. The story had no official name. But over time, people simply called him the Dog of Memory. Not the kind that remembers days gone by, but the kind that knows right from wrong. The kind that remembers what must not be forgotten. Leora's former teacher, Mrs. Mell, brought an apple pie, left it quietly at the front desk, and slipped away. The girl from the bookshop sent a leather-bound notebook filled with small pencil sketches. One of them showed Sentinel lying beneath Leora's feet, forest behind them lit by a distant streak of light. Everyone knew Sentinel didn't care for praise, but everyone wanted to feel they had lived close to something worth remembering. Have you ever thought, Sentinel's like a gatekeeper who never needed commands? Monroe asked during a visit, carrying a newly decrypted file from the higher-ups. Leora smiled, her hand still gently resting on Sentinel's neck. I think he doesn't guard the gate. He holds a path that's real, but if no one remembers it, it disappears. Monroe nodded. You understand something not many dare to believe. Not everyone needs to know everything. Only one person needs to live by what they remember. That night, Leora stayed by the hospital bed. Outside the window, a light snow began to fall over the back garden of the veterinary clinic. Fine white flakes settled over the bare benches and the leafless maple stumps. It wasn't bitter cold, just enough to quiet the world down. She adjusted Sentinel's blanket. He remained still, his breathing slow, and for a fleeting moment she could have sworn the corner of his mouth curled slightly, almost like half a smile, not because he felt better, but maybe because Sentinel somehow understood that life was still going on, and memories didn't need to be explained as long as someone was holding on to them. Leora looked up at the ceiling, where the fluorescent light cast its dull white glow. Maybe tomorrow things would return to normal. She would walk across Maple Street again, and Sentinel would follow, slow but steady. Maybe the adults would still speak of the old project as a technical flaw. Maybe the press would still call it a piece of data not worth saving. But in her heart, and in the hearts of those who'd ever felt Sentinel's gaze, no one saw it as a malfunction. Because the things that are real, when remembered by a dog, can never be erased. The Ridgeway Hall had been cleaned since early morning. Wooden benches had been wiped down, soft bronze ribbons strung along the corridor leading to the auditorium. At the center of the small stage stood a simple wooden podium, beside a plain sign that read, "Honoring our town's four-legged friends. No fireworks, no drums, just a warm, late afternoon where the autumn sun filtered through the windows, brushing shoulders with its golden light, filling the entire hall with a kind of glow that felt like it rose from the earth itself." Leora stood backstage, holding a folded sheet of paper. She had written her speech 3 days earlier, then rewritten it, then scratched it out, then left it blank. In the end, she brought nothing. Just one single line remained in her mind. Down below, Sentinel lay by her grandfather's feet, on a private rug the organizers had laid out. His coat still bore the fine scar near his side, but his eyes hadn't changed. They remained steady, warm, and always fixed on her. When the host called her name, Leora stepped out. Not fast, not slow. She could feel the sun tipping toward dusk, and for a moment the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. "I didn't come here to recount what Sentinel has done," she began, her voice soft but clear. "Because the truth is, there are so many things I don't remember well enough to tell." People leaned in. No one made a sound. "There are fragments of memory without names. Parts of my life erased, or covered up by someone else. I don't know exactly where my mother died. I don't remember where I first went to school, but—" She paused, drew a breath. "I remember Sentinel, and Sentinel somehow has always remembered me." A few eyes began to glisten. Some parents clutched their children's hands a little tighter. Others turned to gently pat the shoulders beside them. "He didn't need to know all my memories. He didn't need to sort out what was right or wrong. He just had to stand there, or lie quietly, or sit beneath a window, and somehow remind me that I'm still me." Leora bowed her head slightly, then looked up, meeting everyone's gaze for the first time. "And that's why Sentinel isn't just a service dog, not an XK9, not a pet. He is a living memory, and the only one who never let that memory be rewritten." A single clap broke the silence. Then another. Then a third. No one asked for it. But within seconds, the entire hall of Ridgeway Hollow rose to their feet. Not for a ceremony, not for a medal, but for the quiet light that Sentinel had brought from the very first day he walked into town. Sentinel didn't move. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if listening, then turned his gaze gently toward the girl standing on stage. And Leora, for the first time since losing her parents, smiled without having to try. That evening, after the ceremony ended, her grandfather rolled his bike from the parking lot while Leora walked beside Sentinel down Maple Street. The sun dipped lower, staining the rooftops a rich amber. Golden leaves drifted, swirling softly onto the pavement, like memories once carried off by wind, now returning step by step with a girl and her dog. No need for directions, no reason to stop. Sentinel didn't walk ahead. He didn't fall behind. He simply walked beside her, in rhythm. And for Leora, that was the truest thing she had ever known. Some memories may blur with time. Some events no one will ever be able to prove. And some stories, like the journey of Leora and Sentinel, will never appear in any official report. But that doesn't make them any less real. On the contrary, it's the unexplainable things that reach the deepest places in us, where emotions don't need names and bonds don't need reasons. Sentinel wasn't a superhero, nor was he a dog with any extraordinary power. He was simply a German shepherd who had walked through the battlefield of his own memories and chose to quietly stand guard beside a girl who had been pulled away from who she truly was. His presence, needing no words, no explanations, was a living testament to loyalty, intuition, and the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. In a world tangled with chaos and pretense, where memories can be rewritten and people often forget who they are, sometimes it only takes the brush of a paw on the knee, an unwavering gaze, or the soft growl of instinct to remind someone of what matters most, who they are, and who never left their side. To love an animal, especially a German shepherd, is not just to care for them, but to learn how to listen, how to trust, and how to walk together. Because sometimes it's the creatures who cannot speak, who end up telling our stories in the truest way possible.